Hi, I'm Zoe Harper, and my sister Natalie told everyone at Thanksgiving dinner that my coffee business was pathetic and I'd never be more than a glorified barista. But here's the twist. Someone else was sitting at that table, someone who had been quietly watching my journey for months, and what she heard that night would change everything. Before I tell you how one phone call turned my sister's world upside down and made me her new boss, I need you to know this isn't just about revenge. It's about the moment I stopped apologizing for my dreams and started owning them. The person listening that night wasn't family, wasn't a friend, but someone whose opinion could reshape our entire industry. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain was hammering against the windows of my parents' house in Beaverton that Thursday evening, the kind of November storm that makes you grateful for warm kitchens and family gatherings. I stood in the doorway holding a bag of my specialty coffee beans, the ones I'd spent 3 years perfecting the roast on, watching my family prepare for what I thought would be a normal Thanksgiving dinner. Mom was bustling around the kitchen in her favorite burgundy apron, the one with tiny turkeys embroidered along the edges that she'd worn every holiday since I was 12. Dad sat in his usual spot at the breakfast bar, reading glasses perched on his nose as he scrolled through his tablet, occasionally chuckling at something he found amusing. My sister Natalie swept through the front door like she owned the place, which in many ways she did. At 32, she commanded attention wherever she went. Her designer heels clicked against the hardwood floors with the kind of confidence that came from closing million-dollar marketing deals and earning more in a month than most people saw in a year. Her hair was perfectly styled in that effortless way that actually required an hour with a professional stylist, and her tailored blazer probably cost more than my rent. She dropped her Louis Vuitton purse on the counter with the casual indifference of someone who had never worried about money, never stayed awake calculating if she could afford both groceries and utilities in the same week. Behind her walked Marcus Reed, her colleague from Pinnacle Creative, the downtown marketing firm where she worked as a senior executive. I'd heard about Marcus through family dinners and holiday stories. He was supposedly some kind of marketing genius, the guy who had helped rebrand 3 major corporations in the past 2 years, and had just been featured in Portland Business Journal as one of the city's rising stars under Ford. He wore an expensive charcoal suit that fit him perfectly, the kind of tailoring that whispered money rather than shouted it, and when he shook Dad's hand, his smile was practiced and professional. But there was someone else with them. Someone I didn't recognize. A woman in her late 40s with silver-streaked auburn hair pulled back in an elegant chignon. She wore a simple black dress that somehow managed to look both understated and incredibly expensive, the kind of outfit that spoke of old money and real power. Her eyes were sharp and observant, taking in details of our modest family home, with the kind of attention that suggested she was used to making important decisions based on what she observed. When Natalie introduced her as Victoria Lawson, a client she was hoping to impress, I assumed she was just another corporate executive looking to hire Pinnacle Creative for some marketing campaign. I had no idea that Victoria Lawson was the CEO of Cascade Holdings, one of the largest investment firms in the Pacific Northwest, a woman who had built her reputation by identifying promising small businesses and turning them into industry leaders. I didn't know she had been researching the artisanal coffee market for 8 months, looking for the perfect acquisition target to launch her company's expansion into the specialty food industry. And I certainly didn't know that she had already visited Grind and Grace, my small coffee roastery in Southeast Portland, 3 times in the past month, always during busy periods when I was too focused on customers to notice one more face in the crowd. The dinner started pleasantly enough. We gathered around Mom's dining room table, the one she'd inherited from her mother and polished to a mirror shine for special occasions. The turkey was golden and perfectly carved, surrounded by all the traditional sides that had graced our family table for decades. Dad said grace, his voice warm and familiar as he thanked God for family, health, and the blessing of being together. Victoria sat quietly during the prayer, her hands folded respectfully, observing our family dynamics with the same careful attention she probably brought to boardroom negotiations. Conversation flowed easily at first. Marcus complimented Mom's stuffing recipe and asked thoughtful questions about Dad's work at the engineering firm. Victoria listened more than she spoke, occasionally asking gentle questions about Portland's business climate or the city's growth over the past decade. She seemed genuinely interested in our family's history, how long we'd lived in Oregon, What had drawn my parents to the Pacific Northwest 30 years ago when they were newlyweds, looking for adventure and opportunity. Natalie dominated much of the conversation, as she always did, regaling everyone with stories from her latest marketing campaign. She described the rebranding project she'd just completed for a major retail chain, how her team had increased their customer engagement by 60% through a combination of social media strategy and guerrilla marketing tactics. Her voice carried that particular mix of pride and casual arrogance that came from being very good at something very lucrative, and she gestured with her wine glass as she spoke, the deep red liquid catching the light from Mom's chandelier. I mostly listened, contributing when asked direct questions, but content to let Natalie hold court. This was normal for our family dinners. She was the successful one, the daughter who had exceeded every expectation and continued to climb higher with each passing year. I was proud of her accomplishments, even if they sometimes made me feel small by comparison. She had always been the star, even as children. Straight A's while I struggled with math, captain of the debate team while I preferred art class, full scholarship to Stanford while I worked my way through Portland State. The conversation eventually turned to current projects and future plans, the natural progression of any gathering that included people at different stages of their career. Marcus mentioned a potential expansion of Pinnacle Creative Services, how they were considering adding brand consulting to their portfolio. Victoria asked thoughtful questions about the local business ecosystem, whether Portland's reputation for supporting small enterprises was accurate or just marketing hype designed to attract entrepreneurs. That's when Natalie's attention turned to me, her eyes bright with what I initially mistook for sisterly interest. She set down her wine glass and leaned forward slightly, the gesture drawing everyone's attention in my direction. I should have recognized the warning signs, the particular tilt of her head that had preceded every cutting remark she'd made throughout our childhood, but I was caught off guard by the warmth in her voice when she said my name. Zoe's been working on her little coffee project for 3 years now. She said, her tone carrying just enough sweetness to mask the condescension underneath. She runs this tiny roastery in southeast Portland, one of those artisanal coffee places that charges $5 for a cup of coffee and acts like they're saving the world one espresso at a time. I felt heat creep up my neck, but I kept my expression neutral. Grind and Grace wasn't just a coffee shop, it was a carefully curated experience built around single-origin beans that I sourced directly from farmers in Guatemala and Ethiopia. Every roast was crafted to bring out the unique characteristics of each bean, and our customers weren't just buying coffee, they were investing in sustainable farming practices and fair trade relationships that actually made a difference in coffee-growing community. But explaining that to Natalie had never gone well in the past, so I simply smiled and reached for my water glass. Marcus seemed genuinely interested, asking about the business model and whether the specialty coffee market in Portland was as saturated as he'd heard. I started to explain how Grind and Grace focused on education as much as sales, how we offered cupping classes and roasting workshops that helped customers understand the complexity and craftsmanship behind truly exceptional coffee. Victoria listened intently, asking questions about sourcing relationships and customer demographics that suggested she understood business fundamentals better than most people at our table. But Natalie wasn't finished. She laughed, a sound that started warm and quickly turned sharp around the edges. The thing is, she continued, turning toward Victoria and Marcus as if I weren't sitting right there. Zoe's always been a dreamer. She thinks her little coffee hobby is going to turn into some kind of empire, but honestly, it's just pathetic watching her pretend this is a real business. She's basically a glorified barista with delusions of grandeur. The words hit like a physical blow, sharp and unexpected and designed to wound. I'd heard variations of this speech before, usually delivered when Natalie had been drinking and felt the need to establish the hierarchy between us, but never in front of strangers, never with such calculated cruelty, and never with someone like Victoria Lawson watching every reaction around the table. Mom's fork clinked against her plate as she set it down too quickly. Dad cleared his throat, the sound loud in the sudden silence that had descended over our dining room. Marcus looked uncomfortable, his eyes fixed on his mashed potatoes as if they contained the secrets of the universe. But Victoria watched everything with the calm attention of someone who had seen corporate boardroom drama unfold and knew how to read the undercurrents of power and resentment that shaped family dynamics. I could have defended myself, could have mentioned that Grind and Grace had turned a profit for 8 straight months, that our customer retention rate was over 80%, that Food and Wine magazine had just featured us in their roundup of must-visit Portland coffee experience. Could have talked about the relationships I'd built with farmers, the sustainable practices we'd implemented, the community of coffee enthusiasts who gathered at our shop, not just for the product, but for the knowledge and passion we brought to every interaction. Instead, I smiled. Not the fake, brittle smile I'd perfected for family gatherings where I felt out of place, but a real smile, warm and genuine and completely unaffected by my sister's attempt to diminish me. Because in that moment, watching Victoria Lawson's face as she absorbed both Natalie's words and my reaction, I realized something important. My sister's opinion of my work mattered far less than my own belief in what I was building. And someone at this table understood the difference between genuine entrepreneurship and corporate ladder climbing. Thank you for sharing your perspective, Natalie, I said, my voice steady and calm. I know it's hard to understand passion projects when you're focused on quarterly reports and client retention metrics, but I'm grateful every day that I get to wake up and do work that actually matters to me, work that connects me to something bigger than market share and profit margin. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Natalie's face flushed, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the angry red that crept up her neck. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by her little sister who was supposed to accept criticism gracefully and know her place in the family hierarchy. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly wishing he was anywhere else, while Mom jumped up to clear plates with unnecessary urgency. But Victoria leaned back in her chair and smiled, a small, knowing expression that suggested she had just witnessed something far more interesting than a typical family squabble. Her eyes met mine across the table, and for a moment, I felt like she was seeing me, really seeing me, in a way that had nothing to do with Natalie's assessment of my worth or my family's expectations of who I should be. The rest of dinner passed in strained politeness, conversation carefully steered toward safer topics like holiday plans and Dad's upcoming retirement. Natalie dominated the discussion again, but there was an edge to her voice now, a brittleness that suggested my response had rattled her more than she wanted to admit. Victoria continued to listen and observe, occasionally asking questions that revealed her sharp intelligence and broad understanding of business trends across multiple industries. When it came time for dessert, Mom's famous apple pie served with vanilla ice cream, Victoria complimented the meal and thanked my parents for their hospitality. She asked thoughtful questions about the recipe, whether the apples came from local orchards, how long Mom had been perfecting her crust technique. It was the kind of gracious conversation that put everyone at ease, and I found myself genuinely liking this woman who had managed to navigate our family drama with such diplomatic skill. As the evening wound down and coats were retrieved from the front closet, Victoria approached me while Natalie was saying goodbye to Mom in the kitchen. She handed me her business card, a simple white rectangle with elegant black lettering that somehow conveyed more authority than the flashiest corporate branding. "I'd love to continue our conversation about the coffee industry," she said, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "Would you be available for lunch next week? I think you might be surprised by how much we have in common." I looked down at the card, my heart pounding as I read the title beneath her name: Victoria Lawson, Chief Executive Officer, Cascade Holdings. I'd heard of Cascade Holdings, of course. Everyone in Portland's business community knew about Victoria's reputation for identifying promising companies and helping them scale to national prominence. What I didn't understand was why she wanted to have lunch with someone Natalie had just dismissed as a glorified barista with delusions of grandeur. "I'd be honored," I managed to say, tucking the card carefully into my pocket. Victoria nodded, shook my hand with a firm grip that spoke of confidence and decision-making authority, and then rejoined the others as they prepared to leave. The drive home to my small apartment above Grind and Grace gave me time to process what had just happened. Southeast Portland looked different in the rain, the streetlights reflecting off wet pavement in patterns that seemed more beautiful than usual. My neighborhood wasn't glamorous by Natalie's standards, filled with food trucks and vintage shops and the kind of authentic local businesses that gave the area its character, but it felt like home in a way that my childhood house never quite had. I climbed the narrow stairs to my apartment, key turning in the lock of a door that opened directly into my kitchen. The space was small but thoughtfully arranged, with exposed brick walls and large windows that let in natural light during the day. I could smell the lingering aroma of coffee beans from the roastery below, a scent that had become as comforting as any childhood memory. This was my world, built slowly and carefully, with every decision reflecting my values and vision for what business could be when it was driven by passion rather than pure profit. I sat at my small dining table, Victoria's business card placed carefully in front of me, and tried to make sense of the evening's events. Natalie's attack hadn't been unexpected, but the presence of Victoria Lawson had changed everything about how it played out. Instead of leaving dinner feeling diminished and defensive, I felt energized, like I'd just passed some kind of test I hadn't known I was taking. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom, a simple message asking if I was okay, and whether I needed to talk about what had happened. I texted back that I was fine, better than fine actually, and that I'd call her tomorrow. I didn't mention Victoria's business card or the lunch invitation that felt like it might change the trajectory of everything I'd been building. The next morning brought the familiar rhythm of opening Grind and Grace for another day. I unlocked the front door at 6:30, breathing in the rich aroma of freshly roasted beans and the warm scent of baked goods from the local bakery that supplied our pastry. The morning light streamed through our large front windows, illuminating the exposed brick walls decorated with photographs of coffee farms and farming families from around the world. Each image told a story of partnership and respect, of relationships built on fair prices and sustainable practices that benefited everyone involved in bringing exceptional coffee from farm to cup. My first customer was Miss Thompson, a retired teacher who came in every morning for a double shot of our Ethiopian Yirgacheffe, and 20 minutes of conversation about everything from local politics to global environmental issues. He was the kind of customer who understood that Grind and Grace was more than a coffee shop. It was a community hub where ideas were shared and relationships were built over carefully crafted beverages. "Good morning, Zoe," he said, settling onto his usual stool at the counter. "How was your Thanksgiving?" Family gatherings can be such interesting exercises in diplomacy. Mr. Thompson had a gift for understatement that always made me smile. I told him about dinner while I prepared his coffee, focusing on the positive aspects of seeing family and sharing Mom's excellent cooking. I didn't mention Natalie's comments or Victoria's mysterious interest in continuing our conversation, but something in my voice must have conveyed that the evening had been more eventful than usual. "You seem different this morning," he observed, accepting his cup with the reverence he always showed for our coffee. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. More centered somehow, like you figured something out that was puzzling you before. Mr. Thompson's insights were often more accurate than I was comfortable admitting. "Maybe I have," I said, wiping down the espresso machine with more attention than it required. "Sometimes it takes an outside perspective to help you see your own situation clearly." The morning rush brought a steady stream of regulars and newcomers, each interaction reminding me why I'd chosen this path, despite the financial challenges and family skepticism. There was Mrs. Sheen, who brought her laptop every Tuesday and Thursday to work on her novel while sipping our Guatemalan single origin. The college students who gathered around our large communal table for study sessions, fueled by our house blend and the free Wi-Fi that came without time limits or pressure to keep ordering. The young professionals who stopped by before work, trusting us to craft beverages that would start their days with intention rather than just caffeine. Each customer represented a choice to support small business, to invest in relationships rather than convenience, to prioritize quality over speed. They were proof that Natalie's assessment was wrong, that what we were building at Grind and Grace mattered to people who understood the difference between commodity coffee and crafted experiences. Around 10:30, during the brief lull between morning rush and lunch prep, I called Victoria Lawson's office. Her assistant, a woman with a warm voice and professional manner, confirmed that Victoria was available for lunch on Tuesday and suggested the Pearl Room, an upscale restaurant in downtown Portland known for its sophisticated atmosphere and excellent service. I spent the weekend researching everything I could find about Cascade Holdings and Victoria's track record as an investor and business builder. What I discovered both impressed and intimidated me. She had started her career in traditional finance before transitioning to strategic investments focused on companies with strong ethical foundations and growth potential. Her portfolio included a sustainable clothing manufacturer that had grown from 3 employees to 300 under her guidance, a tech startup that developed environmental monitoring software for agricultural application, and a chain of farm-to-table restaurants that had expanded from Portland to Seattle while maintaining their commitment to local sourcing. Every company she invested in shared common characteristics beyond their financial success. They were built by passionate entrepreneurs who prioritized long-term sustainability over short-term profits, who understood that business could be a force for positive change when guided by clear values and authentic purpose. Reading about her philosophy and approach, I began to understand why she might be interested in Grind and Grace, but I couldn't quite believe that my small coffee roastery could be significant enough to warrant her attention. Tuesday arrived with the kind of crisp November weather that made Portland feel alive and energetic. I chose my outfit carefully for lunch with Victoria, settling on a navy blazer over a cream blouse with dark jeans and boots that split the difference between professional and approachable. I wanted to look like someone who took business seriously without trying to be something I wasn't. The Pearl Room was exactly the kind of restaurant where Natalie would feel completely at home, all polished surfaces and understated elegance that whispered expensive rather than shouted it. Victoria was already seated when I arrived, occupying a corner table that offered privacy while still allowing her to observe the room. She stood to greet me, her handshake as firm and confident as I remembered, and I noticed she was wearing a charcoal gray suit that managed to look both authoritative and feminine. The server appeared immediately, the kind of attentive service that comes from recognizing regular customers who tip well and make reservations worth accommodating. "I appreciate you making time for this," Victoria said once we'd ordered, her voice carrying the same thoughtful tone I remembered from Thanksgiving dinner. "I've been following the specialty coffee industry for several months now, and your operation keeps coming up in conversations with people whose opinions I respect." The statement caught me off guard. I'd assumed our meeting was more about general industry trends than anything specific to Grind and Grace. I tried to think of who might have mentioned my small roastery to someone of Victoria's stature, but the Portland coffee community was tight-knit enough that word could travel in unexpected directions. "I'm curious what you've heard," I said, genuinely interested in understanding how my business appeared from the outside. "We're not exactly operating at a scale that usually generates industry attention." Victoria smiled, the expression warm but sharp around the edges in a way that suggested she was used to negotiations where information was power. "That's exactly what makes you interesting. You've built something sustainable and authentic in a market that's increasingly dominated by companies trying to manufacture authenticity through marketing campaigns. Your customer retention numbers are remarkable, your sourcing relationships are genuinely ethical rather than performative, and your financial management shows someone who understands the difference between growth and expansion." I felt a flutter of pride mixed with confusion. Victoria clearly knew more about Grind and Grace than I'd expected, the kind of detailed knowledge that suggested serious research rather than casual interest. I wondered how she'd obtained financial information that I'd never shared publicly, but corporate due diligence probably involved resources and connections I couldn't imagine. The conversation flowed naturally from there, covering everything from coffee sourcing challenges to the economics of small batch roasting. Victoria asked thoughtful questions about my relationships with farmers, how I'd developed my palate for evaluating green beans, what systems I'd implemented to ensure consistency across different rows. Her questions revealed someone who understood business fundamentals but was genuinely curious about the craft aspects that made specialty coffee different from commodity trading. We talked about the broader industry trends, how consolidation was affecting everything from farm prices to retail distribution. Victoria shared insights from her research into food and beverage investments, explaining how she evaluated companies based on their ability to maintain authenticity while scaling operations. She spoke about the challenge of growing businesses without losing the personal relationships and attention to detail that made them special in the first place. What struck me most was how seriously she took what I did. There was no condescension, no suggestion that coffee was somehow less important than other industries she'd worked with. She understood that expertise was expertise, whether it involved evaluating merger opportunities or determining the optimal roast profile for Ethiopian beans. When I described the complexity of managing inventory for single-origin coffees that were only available during specific harvest windows, She nodded with the recognition of someone who appreciated logistical challenge. The lunch stretched into 2 hours, our conversation ranging across topics that revealed shared values about sustainable business practices and the importance of treating employees and suppliers as partners rather than resources to be exploited. Victoria described her investment philosophy, how she looked for companies led by people who genuinely cared about their work and understood that long-term success required more than just profit maximization. Near the end of our meal, Victoria leaned back in her chair and studied me with the kind of direct attention that made me simultaneously nervous and excited. "I'm going to be frank with you, Zoe," she said. "I've been looking for the right opportunity to enter the specialty coffee market for almost a year. Not because I think it's a quick path to profits, but because I believe there's room for a company that can scale ethical sourcing and educational programming without sacrificing quality or authenticity." My heart started beating faster, but I tried to keep my expression neutral. Victoria was clearly building towards something significant, and I wanted to hear her complete proposal before reacting. "Grind and Grace represents everything I've been looking for," she continued. "You've proven that customers will pay premium prices for exceptional experiences. You've built genuine relationships with suppliers that would be difficult for competitors to replicate, and you've created a brand that stands for something meaningful rather than just clever marketing. What you haven't had is access to the capital and strategic support that could help you expand your impact." The word expand sent a chill through me. I'd heard too many stories about small businesses that lost their souls during scaling, about entrepreneurs who found themselves managing operations that no longer reflected their original vision. But Victoria seemed to anticipate my concern. "I'm not talking about opening 50 locations and becoming another generic coffee chain," she said. "I'm talking about strategic growth that amplifies what you're already doing well. Better equipment that allows you to roast larger batches without sacrificing quality. A larger space that can accommodate more educational programming. Direct trade relationships that provide farmers with better prices and more predictable income streams." She paused, letting her words settle before continuing. "I'm also talking about acquiring complementary businesses that share your values and could benefit from your expertise. Companies that are struggling financially but doing important work in sustainable agriculture or ethical food production." The scope of what she was describing was far beyond anything I'd imagined for Grind and Grace. I'd been focused on survival and gradual growth, on building a sustainable business that could support me and a small team while making a positive impact in our immediate community. Victoria was talking about something much larger, the kind of expansion that could influence industry practices and create opportunities for dozens or hundreds of other businesses. But there was something else in her proposal, something that made my chest tighten with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She was talking about acquisition, about buying other companies, that suggested a level of capital and authority that went far beyond expanding my current operation. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the adrenaline that was making my hands slightly shaky. Victoria's smile was all business now, the expression of someone who was used to making offers that changed people's lives. "I'm proposing that Cascade Holdings acquire Grind and Grace as the foundation for a new division focused on ethical food and beverage companies. You would remain as the division head, with complete operational control and an equity stake that reflects your role in building something from nothing. More importantly, you'd have the resources to pursue opportunities that are currently beyond your reach." The restaurant seemed to fade around us as I processed what she was saying. Victoria wasn't just offering to invest in my business, she was offering to make me a key executive in a much larger operation. The coffee roastery that Natalie had dismissed as pathetic would become the cornerstone of a new business division with real influence in sustainable food systems. "I need to think about this," I said, though part of me wanted to say yes immediately. The logical side of my brain knew that decisions this significant required careful consideration. Research into Cascade Holdings' track record with acquisitions, legal review of any eventual contract. But the emotional side was already imagining what it would feel like to call Natalie and casually mention that I'd just been promoted to division head of a major investment firm. "Of course," Victoria said, signaling for the check with the kind of subtle gesture that suggested she was used to restaurants where the bill appeared without being requested. "Take all the time you need. This is the kind of decision that should be made thoughtfully, not impulsively." She handed me a folder that had been sitting beside her chair throughout lunch, thick enough to contain substantial documentation. This has more details about the proposed structure, financial projections, and examples of how we've handled similar acquisitions in the past. I think you'll find that we're serious about maintaining the integrity of the companies we work with. Walking back to my car, folder tucked under my arm like it contained state secrets, I felt like I was moving through a different world than the one I'd inhabited that morning. The Portland streets looked the same, but everything felt charged with possibility in a way that made even familiar sights seem new and significant. I drove back to Southeast Portland in a daze, my mind racing between excitement and skepticism as I tried to process the magnitude of what Victoria had just offered. Grind and Grace looked smaller when I returned, though nothing had actually changed about the space. The afternoon light was streaming through our front windows, illuminating the same exposed brick walls and carefully arranged displays of coffee equipment that had felt so perfect just a few hours earlier. But now I was seeing it through Victoria's eyes, imagining how our operation might look to someone thinking about industry-wide impact rather than neighborhood community building. Kelsey Wang was working the afternoon shift, her movements around the espresso machine as fluid and practiced as a dancer who'd performed the same routine 1,000 times. She'd been with Grind and Grace for 8 months, ever since graduating from Portland State with a degree in environmental science and a passion for sustainable agriculture that made her perfect for explaining our sourcing practices to curious customers. "How did lunch go?" she asked, not looking up from the elaborate latte art she was creating for a customer who'd become a regular specifically because of Kelsey's skill with steamed milk and espresso. "You look like someone who just got very good news or very complicated news." Kelsey had an intuitive understanding of people that made her invaluable for customer service, but sometimes her perceptiveness was unsettling. I settled onto the stool behind our register, Victoria's folder still clutched in my hands like evidence of a conversation I wasn't sure had actually happened. "Complicated good news," I said, which was probably the most accurate description I could manage, the kind that requires a lot of thinking and possibly some legal advice. The afternoon passed slowly, each familiar interaction with customers feeling somehow different now that I was considering a future that might involve very different responsibilities and opportunities. Mrs. Shin came in for her usual Tuesday writing session, setting up her laptop at our corner table with the kind of focused determination that had helped her complete 3 chapters of her novel in the past month. The college students arrived for their study group, spreading textbooks and notebooks across our communal table while debating everything from organic chemistry to local politics. Each customer represented a relationship that had taken months or years to build, people who chose Grind and Grace, not just for our coffee but for the sense of community and shared values that we'd worked so hard to create. The thought of expanding beyond this intimate scale was both thrilling and terrifying, especially when I considered how many larger operations had lost the personal touch that made them special in the first place. I waited until we'd closed and Kelsey had gone home before opening Victoria's folder, spreading the documents across our largest table like I was preparing to study for the most important exam of my life. The financial projections were impressive but not unrealistic, based on market research that showed growing demand for ethically sourced food and beverage products. The organizational structure would give me significant autonomy while providing access to resources that could transform how we operated. Most importantly, the examples of previous acquisitions showed a track record of companies that had maintained their core values while expanding their reach and impact. A sustainable clothing manufacturer that had grown from regional to national distribution without compromising their commitment to fair labor practices. An organic food distributor that had expanded into new markets while actually strengthening their relationships with local farmers. The more I read, the more I understood that Victoria wasn't just offering me money or opportunity, she was offering me the chance to prove that business could be a force for positive change when guided by authentic values rather than pure profit motive. It was the difference between selling out and scaling up, between abandoning principles for growth and using growth to amplify principles. I called my parents that evening, needing to talk through the opportunity with people who knew me well enough to ask the right question. Dad answered on the second ring, his voice warm with the kind of parental concern that never quite disappeared, no matter how old your children got. "How are you feeling about everything, sweetheart?" he asked, and I knew he was referring to Thanksgiving dinner rather than my general state of mind. Your mother and I have been worried about you since Thursday night. I'm actually feeling pretty good, I said, settling into my small kitchen with a cup of tea and the view of Southeast Portland's evening lights through my window. In fact, something pretty amazing happened today that might put Thursday night in a whole new perspective. I told them about lunch with Victoria, trying to convey both the magnitude of the opportunity and my uncertainty about how to evaluate it properly. Dad asked practical questions about the financial structure and timeline for any potential transition. Mom focused on whether I trusted Victoria's intentions and felt confident about maintaining control over the aspects of the business that mattered most to me. Their questions helped clarify my own thinking, forcing me to articulate what success would look like beyond just financial growth. I realized that my biggest concern wasn't about whether the opportunity was good for me personally, but whether it would allow me to have a positive impact on the coffee industry and the farming communities that supplied our beans. The next morning brought a familiar rhythm that felt both comforting and strange, like going through motions that might soon belong to a different version of my life. I opened Grind and Grace at the usual time, breathing in the aroma of freshly roasted beans, while mentally cataloging all the small details that made our operation work smoothly. The way morning light hit our retail display, showing off the carefully labeled bags of single-origin coffees, the sound of our vintage espresso machine warming up, a gentle hissing that had become as familiar as my own breathing, the sight of our cupping table, set up for the weekly coffee education class that brought together everyone from complete beginners to serious enthusiasts. Miss Thompson arrived at his usual time, settling onto his preferred stool with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd found his place in the world. I prepared his Ethiopian yirgacheffe, while we talked about the weather and local politics, the kind of easy conversation that had become one of my favorite parts of each day. You seem thoughtful this morning, he observed, accepting his cup with the appreciation he always showed for carefully prepared coffee. Like you're weighing important decisions. Miss Thompson's perceptiveness never failed to surprise me, though I should have been used to it after months of daily interactions. I'm considering some changes that could be very good for the business, I said, which was probably the most diplomatic way to describe Victoria's proposal, the kind of opportunities that don't come along very often. He nodded sagely, taking a careful sip of his coffee before responding. Change can be frightening even when it's positive, he said. The key is making sure that whatever you choose aligns with who you are rather than who you think you should become. His words stayed with me throughout the morning as I served customers and managed the daily operations that had become second nature. Each interaction reminded me of why I'd started Grind and Grace in the first place, but also highlighted the limitations of what we could accomplish at our current scale. When a customer asked about our plans for offering more educational programming, I found myself thinking about the larger classroom space that Victoria's resources could provide. When another customer mentioned how much they wished they could find ethically sourced coffee in other cities they traveled to, I imagined the network of partner businesses that could make that possible. By lunchtime, I'd made my decision. Not because I was certain about every aspect of Victoria's proposal, but because I was certain about my own values and confident that she understood the difference between growth and compromise. I called her office and arranged another meeting for Thursday, this time in my territory at Grind and Grace itself. Victoria arrived exactly on time, dressed in dark jeans and a wool sweater that suggested she'd researched our neighborhood and chosen an outfit that wouldn't make her stand out among the food trucks and vintage shops that gave Southeast Portland its character. She ordered our house blend, black, and complimented the roasting profile in terms that showed she'd done her homework about coffee as well as business. I've read through everything, I said, gesturing toward the folder that sat on the table between us like a bridge between my current life and whatever came next. I have questions about implementation and timeline, but I'm interested in moving forward. Victoria's smile was professional but warm, the expression of someone who was pleased but not surprised by my decision. I was hoping you'd say that, she said. I think we can build something significant together, something that proves business can be both profitable and principled. We spent the next 2 hours discussing details that would have seemed impossibly complex just a week earlier. Legal structure and equity distribution, timeline for expansion and integration with Cascade Holdings' existing operations, strategies for maintaining company culture while scaling operations. Victoria had clearly thought through every aspect of the acquisition, but she was also flexible about adapting her plans based on my insights about the coffee industry and customer relationship. The most important conversation centered on my role going forward and how much autonomy I'd have in making operational decisions. Victoria was clear that she valued my expertise and wanted me to have significant independence, but she also needed to ensure that any expansion aligned with Cascade Holdings' overall investment strategy and risk management protocol. By the time she left, we'd outlined a preliminary agreement that would make me head of a new sustainable food and beverage division, with Grind and Grace as the flagship operation and authority to evaluate potential acquisitions in related industry. The financial terms were more generous than I'd dared to hope, but more importantly, the structure would give me resources to pursue opportunities that could benefit entire communities rather than just individual businesses. I spent that evening walking through my neighborhood, seeing familiar sights with the kind of heightened awareness that comes from knowing that significant change is imminent. The food carts that lined Division Street, each representing someone's entrepreneurial dream and willingness to take risks for the chance to share their passion with others. The vintage shops and art galleries that gave the area its creative energy, proof that success could be measured in community impact rather than just financial return. Everything looked the same, but I felt different, like I was carrying knowledge that would soon transform not just my own life but potentially the lives of many other small business owners who were struggling to balance their values with economic reality. Victoria's proposal wasn't just about acquiring Grind and Grace. It was about creating a model for ethical business that could influence industry practices and provide other entrepreneurs with resources they needed to succeed without compromising their principles. The thought of calling Natalie kept surfacing throughout my walk, though I wasn't ready to have that conversation yet. There would be time for family discussions once the legal paperwork was finalized and I could speak with the authority of someone whose position was secure rather than tentative. But I couldn't help imagining her reaction when she learned that her pathetic little sister had just become a division head at one of the Pacific Northwest's most respected investment firms. Friday morning brought the familiar routine of opening Grind and Grace, but everything felt charged with anticipation as I waited for Victoria's legal team to finalize the documents we'd discussed. Kelsey noticed my distracted energy immediately, commenting that I seemed like someone who was keeping a very good secret. "I might have some interesting news to share soon," I said, which was probably the closest I could come to explaining my mood without getting into details that weren't yet finalized. The kind of news that could change how we think about what's possible here. The morning rush proceeded normally, each customer interaction feeling both routine and precious as I considered how our operations might evolve in the coming months. Mrs. Chan arrived for her writing session, setting up her laptop with the focused determination that had helped her maintain a consistent creative schedule despite the distractions of daily life. The college students gathered for their study group, spreading textbooks across our communal table while discussing everything from environmental policy to sustainable agriculture. Each conversation reminded me of why community mattered, but also highlighted the potential for extending our impact beyond our immediate neighborhood. When a customer mentioned how difficult it was to find ethically sourced coffee in her hometown of Salem, I found myself imagining a network of partner businesses that could serve communities throughout the Pacific Northwest. When another customer asked about opportunities to visit coffee farms and learn more about our sourcing relationships, I thought about the educational travel programs that adequate funding could make possible. Victoria called around noon with news that the preliminary paperwork was ready for review, suggesting we meet Monday morning to sign documents and begin the transition process. The timeline was faster than I'd expected, but it reflected the thoroughness of her preparation and the straightforward nature of our agreement. "I'm excited to get started," she said, her voice carrying the kind of energy that comes from seeing a long-planned project finally come together. "I think we're going to accomplish things that neither of us could manage independently." After hanging up, I found myself staring at the phone like it had just delivered news from another planet. In 3 days, I would officially become head of Cascade Holdings' new sustainable food and beverage division, with authority to evaluate acquisitions and expansion opportunities across the Pacific Northwest. The coffee roastery that my sister had dismissed as pathetic would become the foundation for a business operation with real influence over industry practices and community development. The weekend passed in a blur of research and preparation, reading everything I could find about successful acquisitions in the food and beverage industry, while making lists of potential partner businesses that shared our values and could benefit from additional resources. I called several of my sourcing contacts, coffee farmers and importers who understood both the challenges and opportunities in ethical agriculture, getting their perspectives on what kinds of expansion would be most beneficial for farming communities. Sunday evening brought an unexpected phone call from my cousin Rachel, Natalie's closest friend since college and someone who'd always treated me with the kind of polite indifference reserved for younger siblings who weren't quite important enough to dislike actively. Her voice carried an unusual urgency that immediately put me on alert. "Zoe, I hope you don't mind me calling," she said, her words coming faster than usual. "I was having dinner with Natalie tonight and she mentioned some concerns about your business situation. She's worried that you might be getting involved with people who don't have your best interests at heart." The phrasing was careful and diplomatic, but I could hear Natalie's voice behind Rachel's words. My sister had clearly been doing research about Victoria and Cascade Holdings, probably trying to understand why someone of Victoria's stature would be interested in my small operation. The fact that she'd enlisted Rachel to make this call suggested she was more concerned than she wanted to admit directly. "I appreciate the concern," I said, choosing my words as carefully as Rachel had chosen hers, "but I'm confident about the decisions I'm making. I've done my research and consulted with people whose judgment I trust." Rachel's pause suggested she was weighing how much pressure to apply without crossing lines that might damage our relationship permanently. "Natalie just wants to make sure you understand the risks involved in dealing with corporate investors," she said, finally. She's seen situations where small business owners thought they were getting opportunities, but ended up losing control of everything they'd built. The irony wasn't lost on me that Natalie, who had publicly dismissed my work as pathetic, was now concerned about protecting it from corporate exploitation. But I also understood that her worry might be genuine, motivated by the same protective instincts that had made her such a fierce advocate for our family during childhood, even when her methods were sometimes hurtful. "Thank you for calling," I said, meaning it despite my frustration with the indirect communication. "I know Natalie cares about me, even when we don't see eye to eye about business decisions, but I need her to trust that I'm capable of evaluating opportunities and making choices that align with my values." Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp December weather that made Portland feel alive and full of possibility. I dressed carefully for my meeting with Victoria, choosing a navy suit that projected professionalism while still feeling authentically like myself. The documents were waiting in her office, thick legal papers that would transform my relationship with Grind & Grace from sole proprietor to division head of a major investment firm. Victoria's office occupied the top floor of a downtown building, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered sweeping views of the Willamette River and the mountains beyond. The space was elegantly appointed but not ostentatious, furnished with pieces that suggested good taste and financial success without crossing into intimidating luxury. Everything about the environment reinforced my impression that Victoria understood the difference between authentic authority and performative wealth. The signing process was surprisingly straightforward, each document explained clearly by Victoria's legal team and structured in ways that protected both my interests and Cascade Holdings' investment. The equity arrangement was more generous than most acquisitions, reflecting Victoria's recognition that my knowledge and relationships were as valuable as the physical assets being acquired. When we finished signing the last page, Victoria stood and offered her hand with a smile that mixed professional satisfaction with genuine warmth. "Welcome to Cascade Holdings," she said. "I'm looking forward to seeing what we can build together." The words felt surreal, like dialogue from someone else's life rather than my own. Just 1 week after Natalie had dismissed my work as pathetic, I was shaking hands with one of the Pacific Northwest's most respected business leaders, as her newest division head. The coffee roastery that had been struggling to turn consistent profits was now the cornerstone of an operation with real potential to influence industry practices and community development throughout the region. Walking back to my car, official documents tucked securely in my briefcase, I felt like I was moving through a different world than the one I'd inhabited that morning. Downtown Portland looked the same, but everything felt charged with possibility in a way that made even familiar sights seem new and significant. I had work to do, relationships to nurture and opportunities to evaluate, but first I had a phone call to make. I waited until I was back at Grind & Grace, surrounded by the familiar aromas and sounds that had defined my daily life for 3 years. Before dialing Natalie's number, she answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the brisk efficiency she used for business calls during working hours. "Hi, Natalie," I said, settling into the chair behind our retail counter where I'd spent countless hours serving customers and building relationships. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important at Pinnacle Creative, Zoe." Natalie's voice carried surprise mixed with something that might have been concern. "This is unexpected. Is everything okay?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with years of complicated family dynamics and the memory of Thanksgiving dinner that had changed everything. I took a deep breath, looking around at the coffee shop that had just become something much larger than either of us had imagined possible. "Everything's wonderful actually," I said, keeping my voice light and conversational. "I wanted to share some news with you. You know that pathetic little coffee business you mentioned last week? It turns out someone else had a very different opinion about its potential." There was a pause, the kind of silence that meant Natalie was calculating implications and trying to stay ahead of a conversation that wasn't following her expected script. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted into the careful tone she used when she sensed she might be at a disadvantage. "What kind of news?" she asked, and I could practically hear her mind racing through possibilities, none of which would prepare her for what I was about to say. "I just finished signing paperwork with Victoria Lawson," I said, savoring each word like a perfectly brewed cup of single-origin coffee. "Remember her? Your client from Thanksgiving dinner? She's made me head of a new division at Cascade Holdings, with Grind and Grace as our flagship operation." The silence that followed was so complete I wondered if the call had dropped. I checked my phone screen to confirm we were still connected, watching the seconds tick by while Natalie processed information that didn't fit her understanding of how the world was supposed to work. "That's impossible," she said, finally, her voice tight with the kind of control that suggested she was fighting to maintain her composure. "Victoria Lawson is our client. She's considering hiring Pinnacle Creative for a major campaign. There's no way she would invest in your coffee shop without going through proper channels." The assumption behind her words was so perfectly Natalie that I almost laughed. In her mind, any significant business opportunity had to flow through her world, through the marketing firms and corporate networks where she held influence and authority. The idea that someone like Victoria might value different kinds of expertise or see potential in operations that didn't fit traditional corporate models was simply outside her frame of reference. "Actually," I said, allowing myself to enjoy this moment of revelation, "Victoria has been researching the specialty coffee market for months. She visited Grind and Grace several times before Thanksgiving, observing our operations and customer relationships. When she heard your assessment of my work, it helped her understand exactly what kind of entrepreneur she was looking for." I could hear Natalie's breathing change, becoming shorter and more controlled as she struggled to process information that contradicted everything she thought she knew about business hierarchies and professional relationships. The confident executive who dominated every family gathering was encountering a situation where her expertise and connections were irrelevant, where her little sister had access to opportunities that existed completely outside her sphere of influence. "This doesn't make sense," she said, her voice carrying the frustrated edge that appeared whenever she couldn't control or predict outcomes. "Victoria Lawson doesn't invest in small businesses. Cascade Holdings focuses on major acquisitions and corporate partnership. You must be misunderstanding something about whatever arrangement you think you've made." The patronizing tone was familiar, the same dismissive attitude that had shaped our relationship since childhood. But this time, instead of making me feel small and uncertain, it highlighted how completely Natalie had misjudged both the situation and my capabilities. She was still thinking in terms of her corporate world, where success was measured by traditional metrics and opportunities followed predictable patterns. "I'm not misunderstanding anything," I said, my voice steady and confident in a way that felt new and powerful. Victoria explained her investment strategy very clearly. She looks for businesses that combine authentic expertise with strong ethical foundations and growth potential. Grind and Grace met all her criteria, and our conversation at Thanksgiving dinner convinced her that I was the kind of leader she wanted to work with. The mention of Thanksgiving dinner seemed to hit Natalie like a physical blow. I could almost see her replaying that evening, remembering her confident dismissal of my work while Victoria listened and observed. The realization that her own words had helped seal a deal that placed her little sister in a position of corporate authority must have been devastating to someone who prided herself on reading people and controlling situations. You're telling me that Victoria Lawson was evaluating your business during our family dinner. Natalie's voice was rising now, the careful control beginning to crack as the implications became clear, that she was there as an investor rather than as our potential client. The confusion in her voice was almost painful to hear. Natalie's entire professional identity was built on her ability to read situations accurately, to understand power dynamics and position herself advantageously within them. The discovery that she had completely misread the most important business conversation of her career was shaking the foundations of her self-confidence. Victoria was there as your guest, I said, choosing my words carefully to be accurate without being cruel. But she's always evaluating opportunities, and she'd already identified Grind and Grace as a potential acquisition target. Your comments about my work helped her understand that I wouldn't be easily swayed by traditional corporate pressures or distracted from my core values by superficial measures of success. Each word seemed to land like a small explosion in the silence that followed. I could imagine Natalie sitting in her perfectly appointed office at Pinnacle Creative, surrounded by awards and client testimonials that suddenly felt less significant than they had an hour earlier. Her little sister, the one she'd dismissed as a glorified barista, was now speaking with the authority of someone who had just been handed resources and opportunities that dwarfed anything Natalie had achieved in her marketing career. What exactly does this division head position involve? She asked, her voice carefully modulated but unable to hide the underlying tension. Are you reporting to other executives or do you have actual decision-making authority? The question revealed how desperately she wanted to find some way to minimize what had happened, to discover that my new role was somehow less significant than it appeared. But Victoria had been very clear about the scope of my responsibilities and the independence I would have in building the new division. I have complete operational authority over the sustainable food and beverage division, I said, enjoying the way the title sounded when spoken aloud. I report directly to Victoria, and I have approval authority for acquisitions up to $5 million. My first priority is expanding Grind and Grace's educational programming and sourcing relationships, but I'm also evaluating potential partnerships with other businesses that share our values and could benefit from additional resources. The numbers seemed to hit Natalie particularly hard. $5 million in acquisition authority was more than most senior executives at marketing firms ever controlled, and the idea that her little sister now had that kind of corporate responsibility was clearly beyond anything she had imagined possible. I don't understand how this happened so quickly, she said, her voice taking on the plaintive quality of someone who was used to being included in important decisions and couldn't accept being completely blindsided. These kinds of arrangements usually take months of negotiations and due diligence. Victoria can't have made this decision based on one dinner conversation. Her need to understand the timeline was touching in a way, as if somehow knowing the process might help her regain some sense of control over a situation that had spiraled completely beyond her influence. But it also revealed how little she understood about how successful entrepreneurs actually operated, how quickly decisions could be made when all parties shared clear values and complementary expertise. Victoria had been researching the coffee industry for almost a year, I explained. She knew exactly what she was looking for, and she'd already identified Grind and Grace as a potential fit before Thanksgiving dinner. Our conversation that night just confirmed her assessment of our company culture and my leadership style. The legal paperwork took less than a week because Victoria's team is very efficient, and the deal structure was straightforward. I could hear Natalie's breathing becoming more labored as the reality of the situation continued to sink in. Her little sister had just closed a major corporate deal in less time than it usually took Pinnacle Creative to prepare a proposal for new clients. Everything she thought she knew about business relationships and professional hierarchies was being challenged by circumstances that didn't fit her understanding of how success was supposed to work. There was a long pause before she spoke again, and when she did, her voice carried a different quality, less confident and more vulnerable than I was used to hearing from her. Zoe, I need to ask you something, And I hope you'll be honest with me. Is this going to affect the relationship between Cascade Holdings and Pinnacle Creative? Victoria was supposed to meet with our team next week to discuss a potential partnership. The question revealed the depth of her concern, but also the fundamental misunderstanding that had shaped her entire approach to our family relationship. Even now, faced with clear evidence that I had succeeded in ways she hadn't anticipated, Natalie was primarily worried about how my success might impact her own professional situation. The idea that my achievements might be valuable in their own right, independent of any effect on her career, still seemed to be beyond her comprehension. I don't have any information about Victoria's other business relationships, I said, which was technically true even though I suspected that her interest in acquiring food and beverage companies might reduce her need for traditional marketing service. That's not really my area of responsibility within the new division. The diplomatic answer seemed to increase rather than reduce Natalie's anxiety. She was smart enough to understand that Victoria's investment strategy might eliminate the need for external marketing support, especially if the acquired companies already had strong brand identities and customer relationships. The potential loss of a major client was probably significant for Pinnacle Creative, but the larger blow was to Natalie's sense of herself as someone who understood business dynamics and could predict important development. Can you at least tell me what Victoria's timeline looks like for expanding the division? Natalie asked, her voice carrying the desperate edge of someone who was trying to salvage something useful from a conversation that had destroyed most of her assumptions about family dynamics and professional relationships. I could hear papers rustling in the background, probably Natalie shuffling through documents related to the Pinnacle Creative proposal that might no longer be relevant. The sound emphasized how quickly circumstances could change in business, how relationships and opportunities that seemed secure could evaporate when new information changed the strategic landscape. We're moving pretty quickly on several fronts, I said, allowing myself to enjoy the reversal of our usual dynamic where Natalie shared important news while I listened passively. The first priority is upgrading our roasting equipment and expanding our retail space to accommodate larger educational programs. After that, we'll be evaluating acquisition opportunities throughout the Pacific Northwest, focusing on businesses that share our commitment to sustainable practices and community development. Each detail seemed to hit Natalie like evidence of a reality she couldn't quite accept. Her little sister wasn't just managing a coffee shop anymore. She was overseeing expansion plans that involved significant capital investment and strategic decision-making. The scope of responsibility was comparable to senior executive positions at major corporations, the kind of roles that Natalie had been working toward throughout her entire career. "Zoe, I have to ask," she said, her voice taking on the careful tone of someone who was afraid of the answer they might receive. "When you said Victoria was impressed by our Thanksgiving conversation, what exactly did you mean? What did she say about my comments regarding your business?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that neither of us wanted to address directly. Natalie was beginning to understand that her dismissive comments about my work hadn't just been hurtful to me personally, they had actively contributed to a business deal that placed me in a position of authority while potentially eliminating opportunities for her own company. "Victoria was very observant that evening," I said, choosing my words carefully to be truthful without being unnecessarily harsh. She told me later that watching our family dynamics helped her understand what kind of pressure I was used to handling and how I responded to criticism. She was particularly impressed by my ability to stay calm and focused on my values even when people I cared about questioned my judgment. The silence that followed was painful in its completeness. I could imagine Natalie replaying every word of our Thanksgiving conversation, understanding, for the first time, that her confident dismissal of my work had been witnessed by someone whose opinion could reshape both our careers. The executive who prided herself on reading people and controlling situations had completely misread the most important audience in the room. "Oh God," she whispered, her voice barely audible through the phone. I had no idea. Victoria never mentioned that she was considering investing in coffee businesses. I thought she was there as a potential client, someone who might hire us for a major campaign. The admission carried a vulnerability I rarely heard from Natalie, an acknowledgement that her usually reliable instincts had failed her completely. But it also revealed the depth of her assumptions about how business relationships worked, her belief that important opportunities would naturally flow through her professional networks, rather than developing independently in spaces she didn't monitor or control. She was researching the industry very thoroughly, I said, feeling a strange mixture of sympathy and satisfaction. She visited Grind and Gray several times over the past few months, always during busy periods when I was too focused on customers to notice her. By the time she came to Thanksgiving dinner, she already knew quite a bit about our operations and financial performance. The revelation that Victoria had been conducting due diligence without anyone at Pinnacle Creative being aware of it seemed to shake Natalie's confidence even further. Her marketing firm specialized in understanding consumer behavior and business trends, but they had completely missed the presence of a major investor in their own local market. How could I have been so wrong about everything? Natalie asked, her voice carrying the bewildered tone of someone whose professional expertise had proven irrelevant at the most critical moment. I've been in marketing for 10 years. I should have recognized what was happening. The self-doubt was so uncharacteristic of Natalie that it almost made me feel sorry for her despite the years of condescension and dismissive comments that had shaped our relationship. But it also represented an opportunity for a different kind of conversation, one where we might be able to move beyond the competitive dynamic that had defined our adult interaction. You were thinking like a marketing executive, I said, trying to offer some perspective that might help her understand what had happened. Victoria wasn't there to evaluate marketing services, she was there to evaluate entrepreneurship and authentic business relationships. Those require different kinds of expertise and different ways of seeing opportunities. The explanation seemed to help slightly, though I could tell that Natalie was still struggling to accept the magnitude of her misreading of the situation. The confident executive who had dominated every family gathering was discovering that her professional skills weren't universally applicable, that success in one area didn't automatically translate to understanding all business contexts. What happens now? She asked, her voice small and uncertain in a way that reminded me of childhood conversations when she was genuinely confused, rather than dismissive. Do you think Victoria would still be interested in working with Pinnacle Creative on other projects? The question revealed how completely the power dynamic between us had shifted. Instead of Natalie offering advice about my business decisions, she was asking for my insights about opportunities in her professional work. The sister who had spent years treating me like someone who didn't understand real business was now seeking my perspective on corporate relationships and strategic planning. I honestly don't know, I said, which was true even though I suspected that Victoria's focus on acquiring and developing sustainable businesses might reduce her need for traditional marketing services. You'd have to ask her directly about her current needs and timeline for external partnership. The suggestion that Natalie would need to approach Victoria independently without being able to leverage our family relationship or my new position at Cascade Holdings seemed to underscore how completely circumstances had changed. She was going to have to rebuild a potential business relationship from scratch, this time without the advantage of insider information or social connection. Zoe, I need to say something, Natalie said, her voice taking on a tone I'd never heard from her before, something that might have been genuine remorse. I owe you an apology for what I said at Thanksgiving dinner. I was wrong about your business, and I was wrong about your potential as an entrepreneur. I let my own insecurities make me dismissive of something I didn't understand. The apology was so unexpected that I found myself momentarily speechless. Throughout our entire relationship, Natalie had never acknowledged being wrong about anything significant, let alone apologized for comments that had hurt me personally or professionally. The admission represented a level of vulnerability and self-reflection that I hadn't known she was capable of. Thank you for saying that, I managed, genuinely moved by her willingness to acknowledge how her words had affected me. I know it's not easy to admit when we've misjudged situations, especially when the consequences are this significant. The forgiveness felt genuine as I spoke it, not because Natalie's comments hadn't hurt, but because her current struggle with accepting new realities had given me perspective on how difficult it must be to have your understanding of the world challenged so completely. She was experiencing something similar to what I'd felt for years, the disorienting sensation of being dismissed by people whose opinions mattered to you. There was another long pause before Natalie spoke again, and when she did, her voice carried a different quality, less defensive and more curious than I was used to hearing from her. Can you tell me what it's like, working with someone like Victoria Loss? I've never had the opportunity to interact with executives at that level of strategic thinking. The question suggested that she was beginning to understand the significance of what had happened, not just for my career but for her own learning about business leadership and investment strategy. The marketing executive who had dismissed my work was now genuinely interested in understanding how successful entrepreneurs actually operated and made decisions. Victoria is extraordinary, I said, meaning every word. She thinks about business in terms of long-term impact, rather than short-term profits, and she understands that authentic relationships with customers and suppliers are more valuable than any marketing campaign. She sees opportunities where other people see only challenges, and she has the patience to invest in building something meaningful rather than just something profitable. Each word seemed to highlight the differences between Victoria's approach to business and the traditional corporate thinking that had shaped Natalie's career. The marketing strategies that dominated her professional world were designed to influence consumer behavior and maximize revenue, while Victoria's investment philosophy focused on supporting businesses that could create positive change in their communities and industries. That sounds incredible, Natalie said, and I could hear genuine admiration in her voice. I think I've been so focused on quarterly results and client satisfaction that I've lost sight of what business can actually accomplish when it's guided by larger purposes. The admission represented a level of self-reflection that I hadn't expected from someone who had always seemed so confident about her professional choices and career trajectory. But it also suggested that our conversation was helping her understand not just what had happened with Victoria, but what might be possible in her own work if she expanded her definition of success beyond traditional metrics. We talked for another 20 minutes, a conversation that felt different from any we'd had as adults. Instead of competing for attention or trying to establish professional superiority, we were sharing perspectives about business philosophy and entrepreneurial thinking. Natalie asked thoughtful questions about sustainable sourcing and customer education, while I gained new appreciation for the complexity of managing multiple client relationships and corporate partnership. When we finally ended the call, I felt like something fundamental had shifted in our relationship. The sister who had dismissed my work as pathetic was beginning to understand that different kinds of expertise could be equally valuable, that success could be measured in community impact as well as corporate advancement. It didn't erase years of competitive dynamics and hurtful comments, but it offered the possibility of building something better going forward. The rest of the week passed in a whirlwind of meetings and planning sessions, as Victoria's team began implementing the expansion strategy we'd outlined. The first priority was upgrading our roasting equipment to handle larger batches while maintaining the quality standards that made our coffee special. Victoria had identified a German manufacturer whose machines were used by some of the world's most respected specialty roasters, and their lead engineer was flying to Portland the following week to assess our space and recommend the optimal configuration. The second priority was expanding our retail and education space to accommodate the cupping classes and roasting workshops that had become increasingly popular with customers who wanted to understand coffee as more than just a caffeine delivery system. Victoria's team had identified a neighboring storefront that would become available in January, and the preliminary designs showed how we could create a dedicated education center while maintaining the intimate atmosphere that made Grind and Grace feel like a community gathering place rather than a commercial operation. Kelsey was ecstatic about the expansion plans, particularly the opportunity to develop more comprehensive educational programming around sustainable agriculture and direct trade relationships. She had ideas for partnerships with local culinary schools and environmental organizations that could bring new audiences to our programs while supporting the broader mission of connecting consumers with the stories behind their food choices. The most exciting development was the pipeline of potential acquisitions that Victoria's research team had identified throughout the Pacific Northwest. Small businesses that shared our values but lacked access to the capital and strategic support they needed to expand their impact. A sustainable bakery in Seattle that had been struggling to find wholesale customers willing to pay fair prices for organic ingredients. An organic food distributor in Eugene that had built strong relationships with local farmers but needed help reaching new markets. A cooperative of Native American artisans who produced traditional foods using sustainable methods but lacked retail distribution network. Each potential partnership represented an opportunity to prove that business could be a force for positive change when guided by authentic values rather than pure profit motives. Victoria's resources would allow us to support entrepreneurs who were already doing important work, helping them reach new audiences while maintaining the integrity that made their products special. Thursday morning brought an unexpected visitor to Grind and Grade. Marcus Reed, Natalie's colleague from Pinnacle Creative, appeared at our counter during the morning rush with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was operating outside his comfort zone. He ordered a cappuccino and waited until the crowd thinned before approaching me with what was clearly a prepared speech. "Zoe, I hope you don't mind me stopping by," he said, his voice carrying the careful diplomacy of someone who was trying to navigate a complicated situation. "Natalie mentioned that you've recently entered into a business relationship with Victoria Lawson, and I wanted to congratulate you on what sounds like an incredible opportunity." The formality of his approach was almost amusing, especially since I'd seen him relaxed and confident at family dinner just 2 weeks earlier. But I also understood that he was probably trying to assess whether my new position at Cascade Holdings might create opportunities or obstacles for Pinnacle Creative's business development effort. "Thank you," I said, preparing his cappuccino with the same attention to detail I brought to every order. "It's been an exciting few weeks, that's for sure." Marcus watched me work with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was trying to understand something beyond just coffee preparation techniques. When I handed him his cup, he paused before taking a sip as if he was gathering courage for whatever he planned to say next. "I have to admit, I completely underestimated what you were building here," he said, gesturing toward our retail space and the customers who filled every table. "When Natalie described your business as a small coffee shop, I assumed it was something relatively simple. But watching you work now and understanding Victoria's interest in acquiring the operation, I can see that there's a lot more complexity and sophistication involved." The admission was gracious and seemed genuine, though I suspected it was motivated at least partly by professional consideration. Marcus was smart enough to understand that my new role at Cascade Holdings might involve evaluating marketing partnerships or acquisition targets that could benefit Pinnacle Creative. And he was probably trying to establish a positive relationship, independent of whatever tensions existed between me and Natalie. "Coffee is a surprisingly complex industry when you dig into the details," I said, appreciating his willingness to acknowledge his initial misunderstanding. "Most people think about it as a commodity, but specialty coffee involves everything from agricultural science to sensory analysis to supply chain management. The business relationships are just as complex as the product development." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, taking a careful sip of his cappuccino before responding. "This is exceptional," he said, and I could tell he was genuinely surprised by the quality. "I drink a lot of coffee, but I've never tasted anything with this level of depth and complexity." I'm beginning to understand why Victoria saw investment potential that wasn't obvious to the rest of us. The comment highlighted one of the fundamental differences between how marketing professionals and investment strategists evaluated businesses. Marcus was trained to think about consumer perception and market positioning, while Victoria focused on operational excellence and sustainable competitive advantages. Both perspectives were valuable, but they led to very different conclusions about what made businesses worth support. We talked for another 15 minutes about the coffee industry and the challenges of building sustainable supply chains that benefited everyone from farmers to consumers. Marcus asked thoughtful questions about our sourcing relationships and customer education programs, and I found myself genuinely liking his curiosity and willingness to learn about industries outside his direct expertise. When he prepared to leave, Marcus paused at the door and turned back toward me with a slightly uncomfortable expression. "Zoe, I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I wanted you to know that Natalie has been doing a lot of thinking since your conversation earlier this week. She's always been competitive, especially about professional success, but I think she's beginning to understand that she may have let that affect how she treated you." The observation was more perceptive than I'd expected from someone who worked closely with Natalie and probably benefited from maintaining positive relationships with all family members. But it also suggested that my sister's self-reflection was visible to colleagues who knew her well, that the shift in our dynamic was affecting her behavior in ways that extended beyond our personal relationship. "I appreciate you telling me that," I said, meaning it despite my uncertainty about how much Natalie might actually change her approach to our relationship. Change is hard for everyone, especially when it involves acknowledging that we've made mistakes that hurt people we care about. Marcus nodded and left with a thoughtful expression that suggested our conversation had given him new perspectives about business evaluation and family dynamic. Watching him walk away, I realized that my new position was creating ripple effects throughout my social and professional networks, forcing people to reconsider assumptions they'd made about entrepreneurship, success, and the kinds of expertise that mattered in contemporary business environments. Friday brought the most significant development yet in my rapidly evolving professional situation. Victoria called with news that her research team had identified a particularly interesting acquisition opportunity, a struggling coffee import business that had built strong relationships with sustainable farms throughout Central America, but lacked the retail distribution and marketing expertise needed to reach premium customers. The business was owned by Angela Vasquez, a former Peace Corps volunteer who had spent 5 years working with coffee cooperatives in Guatemala before returning to Portland and starting an import operation focused on direct trade relationships and fair pricing. Her company, Mountain Source Coffee, had the kind of authentic connections and ethical practices that aligned perfectly with our values. But Angela was facing financial pressures that threatened to force her out of business within the next few months. Victoria wanted me to meet with Angela as soon as possible to assess whether Mountain Source would be a good fit for our growing network of sustainable food and beverage businesses. If the evaluation went well, we could potentially acquire the company and integrate their sourcing expertise with our roasting and retail operations, creating a vertically integrated operation that controlled every step of the process from farm to cup. The opportunity was exactly the kind of strategic expansion that I'd been hoping to pursue. But it also represented my first major decision as division head. The financial commitment was significant, and the success of the integration would depend on my ability to evaluate Angela's business accurately and develop a transition plan that preserved the relationships and practices that made Mountain Source valuable. I arranged to meet Angela at her warehouse in Southeast Portland, a modest space filled with bags of green coffee beans from farms throughout Central America. The aroma was incredible, the rich, earthy scent of coffee in its raw form waiting to be transformed through careful roasting into the complex flavors that defined specialty coffee at its best. Angela was a woman in her early 40s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and hands that showed the calloused evidence of someone who had spent years doing physical work. She moved through her warehouse with the confident efficiency of someone who knew every detail of her operation, explaining the origin and characteristics of different beans with the kind of passionate expertise that reminded me of my own relationship with roast. Her story was both inspiring and heartbreaking. The relationships she'd built with farming families in Guatemala were based on years of trust and mutual respect, developed during her Peace Corps service and maintained through regular visits and consistent fair pricing. But the specialty coffee market in Portland was increasingly dominated by larger operations that could offer lower prices through volume purchasing, and Angela was struggling to find enough retail customers willing to pay premium prices for ethically sourced beans. Walking through her warehouse, seeing the careful attention she paid to storage conditions and quality control, I understood why Victoria had identified Mountain Source as a potential acquisition target. Angela had built exactly the kind of supply chain relationships that would be impossible for competitors to replicate quickly, but she lacked the retail expertise and marketing resources needed to reach customers who would appreciate the value of her work. The financial picture was challenging but not insurmountable. Angela had been operating at a loss for the past 8 months, using personal savings to maintain her commitments to farming partners while hoping that market conditions would improve. Her dedication to honoring existing contracts even when they threatened her financial stability was admirable, but it also demonstrated the kind of principled thinking that made her ideal partner for our expanding operation. By the end of our meeting, I was convinced that acquiring Mountain Source would benefit everyone involved. Angela would gain access to the resources and customer base she needed to expand her impact, while Grind and Grace would gain direct access to some of the highest quality coffee beans available from farms that shared our commitment to sustainable practice. I called Victoria that evening with my recommendation, outlining the strategic benefits of the acquisition and the timeline for integration that would allow us to maintain Angela's existing relationships while expanding her reach. Victoria listened carefully to my assessment, asking detailed questions about financial projections and operational challenges, but I could tell she was pleased with my analysis and confident about moving forward. The acquisition process moved quickly, with Victoria's legal team handling the paperwork while I worked with Angela to develop integration plans that would preserve the aspects of Mountain Source that made it valuable while providing access to resources that could accelerate growth. Within 2 weeks, we had finalized the deal that made Angela our director of sourcing, and added her extensive network of farming relationships to our expanding operation. The success of the Mountain Source acquisition established my credibility within Cascade Holdings and provided a model for future partnerships with businesses that shared our values but needed additional resources to reach their potential. Victoria was impressed with my evaluation process and decision-making, and she gave me approval to pursue additional opportunities that met our criteria for ethical practices and growth potential. More importantly, the acquisition proved that our approach to business development could create positive outcomes for everyone involved. Angela's farming partners gained access to larger markets and more predictable income streams, while our customers gained access to coffee with authentic stories and exceptional quality. The integration process strengthened relationships throughout our supply chain while demonstrating that growth and ethical practices could reinforce rather than conflict with each other. Standing in our expanded operation 3 weeks after signing with Victoria, surrounded by new equipment and additional staff members who shared our commitment to quality and sustainability, I realized how completely my professional life had been transformed. The coffee shop that Natalie had dismissed as pathetic had become the foundation for a business operation with real influence over industry practices and community development throughout the Pacific Northwest. But the most satisfying part wasn't the financial success or corporate recognition. It was the knowledge that we were proving business could be a force for positive change when guided by authentic values rather than pure profit motive. Every decision we made considered the impact on farming communities, environmental sustainability, and customer education, demonstrating that commercial success and social responsibility could work together rather than against each other. The phone call I'd been anticipating finally came on a Monday morning in mid-December, just as the holiday rush was bringing record crowds to our expanded location. Natalie's voice carried a mixture of professional necessity and personal awkwardness that suggested she was calling about business rather than family matters. "Zoe, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," she said, her tone carefully neutral in a way that reminded me of how she spoke to potential clients when she wasn't sure about their interest level. I wanted to reach out about a potential opportunity that might benefit both our companies. The irony wasn't lost on me that my sister, who had spent years dismissing my business acumen, was now calling to propose a professional partnership. I set down the inventory clipboard I'd been reviewing and walked toward my office, a space that had been carved out of our expanded location to accommodate the administrative demands of running a growing division. "What kind of opportunity?" I asked, settling into the chair behind my desk while watching the bustling activity of our morning rush through the glass partition that separated my office from the main retail space. "Pinnacle Creative has been approached by several clients who are interested in developing marketing strategies for sustainable and ethical businesses," Natalie said, her voice carrying the careful professionalism she used when she wasn't certain about her audience's receptiveness. "It's a growing market segment, and we're realizing that our traditional approach to brand development might not be the best fit for companies that prioritize authenticity over conventional marketing metrics." I could hear the admission hidden within her careful phrase. Pinnacle Creative's standard strategies, designed for companies that wanted to project images of success and sophistication, weren't effective for businesses whose customers valued transparency and genuine commitment to social responsibility. The marketing techniques that worked for luxury brands and corporate clients actually undermined trust when applied to companies like ours. "That makes sense," I said, genuinely interested in understanding where she was going with this conversation. Sustainable businesses require different approaches because their customers are usually more informed and skeptical about marketing claims. They can tell the difference between authentic commitment and performative messaging. "Exactly," Natalie said, and I could hear relief in her voice that I was engaging with her ideas rather than dismissing them outright. We've been doing research into this market segment, and we keep coming back to the same conclusion. The most successful sustainable businesses are the ones that focus on education and relationship building rather than traditional advertising and promotion. The observation was accurate, though it represented a significant shift from the marketing philosophy that had built Pinnacle Creative's reputation. Their success had been based on creating compelling narratives that influenced consumer behavior through emotional appeals and aspirational message. But sustainable businesses succeeded by providing detailed information about their practices and allowing customers to make informed decisions based on shared value. We've been particularly impressed by the approach you've taken at Grind and Grace, Natalie continued, her voice taking on the tone she used when she was building toward a specific request. The way you educate customers about coffee origins and farming practices, the transparency about your sourcing relationships, the focus on building community rather than just selling products. It's exactly the kind of authentic engagement that our potential clients are trying to achieve. The compliment was generous, especially coming from someone who had previously dismissed my marketing approach as naive and uncommercial. But I also understood that Natalie was recognizing the effectiveness of strategies she'd once criticized, because those strategies were now relevant to her own business development needs. I appreciate that feedback, I said, meaning it despite my awareness that she was building toward a proposal that would benefit Pinnacle Creative as much as any potential clients. What specifically are you thinking about in terms of collaboration? There was a pause while Natalie gathered her thoughts, and I could imagine her sitting in her perfectly appointed office, surrounded by awards and testimonials that suddenly felt less relevant than they had a month earlier. When she spoke again, her voice carried a vulnerability that I rarely heard from her, the tone of someone who was asking for help, rather than offering expertise. We'd like to propose a consulting arrangement, where you provide strategic guidance for our sustainable business clients, she said, the words coming out slightly faster than usual as if she were rushing to get through them before losing her nerve. Your expertise in authentic customer engagement and ethical business practices would be invaluable for companies that are trying to build trust with socially conscious consumers. The request was both flattering and deeply ironic. My sister, who had spent years treating me like someone who didn't understand real business, was now asking me to share my expertise with her client. The marketing executive who had dismissed my approach as uncommercial was recognizing that commercial success increasingly required the kind of authentic relationship building that I'd been practicing all along. That's an interesting proposal, I said, genuinely considering the possibilities, while also enjoying the complete reversal of our usual dynamic. What would the arrangement look like in practical terms? Would I be working directly with your clients, or providing guidance to your team members who would implement the strategies? The question forced Natalie to acknowledge how much authority she was willing to give me within her professional sphere, whether she was comfortable having me interact directly with clients who might prefer my approach to traditional marketing services. It was a test of how much her attitude toward my expertise had actually changed, versus how much she was simply adapting to circumstances that required my particular skills. We were hoping you could work directly with the clients, Natalie said, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone who was offering something valuable while hoping it would be accepted graciously. Your credibility with sustainable business practices would be much more effective than having our team try to translate your insights secondhand. The admission represented a significant shift in how Natalie viewed my professional capabilities. She was acknowledging that my expertise was not only legitimate but potentially more valuable than her team's traditional marketing knowledge when it came to serving a specific client base. The sister who had called my work pathetic was now recognizing that some aspects of business required different kinds of understanding than what she'd gained through conventional corporate experience. I'd be interested in exploring that possibility, I said, which was true despite my reservations about working too closely with Natalie's business operations. But I'd want to understand more about the specific clients and what kinds of guidance they're looking for. My approach works best when there's genuine alignment between business practices and marketing messages. The condition was important because I'd seen too many companies that wanted to appear sustainable without actually changing their operations. Businesses that were looking for marketing strategies to project environmental responsibility while maintaining practices that contradicted those messages. Working with Pinnacle Creative would only make sense if their clients were genuinely committed to the values they wanted to communicate. That's exactly why we need your involvement, Natalie said, her voice carrying genuine enthusiasm now that I'd expressed interest rather than skepticism. We've been approached by companies that are already implementing sustainable practices, but struggling to communicate their value proposition effectively. They need someone who understands the operational side as well as the marketing side. The clarification addressed my primary concern about working with businesses that prioritized image over substance. If Pinnacle Creative's potential clients were already committed to sustainable practices, then marketing guidance could help them reach audiences who shared their values, rather than manipulating consumers who might be misled by false claims. We talked for another 20 minutes about the kinds of services I might provide, and how the collaboration might be structured to benefit everyone involved. Natalie was surprisingly flexible about financial arrangements and decision-making authority, perhaps because she understood that my expertise was becoming increasingly valuable in a market that was moving away from traditional marketing approaches. The conversation felt different from any professional discussion we'd ever had, characterized by mutual respect and genuine curiosity, rather than the competitive dynamic that had shaped our relationship throughout adulthood. Natalie asked thoughtful questions about customer education strategies and community engagement, while I gained new appreciation for the complexity of managing multiple client relationships with varying needs and expectations. When we ended the call, I felt cautiously optimistic about the possibility of working together professionally, while maintaining appropriate boundaries around our personal relationship. The sister who had dismissed my work was beginning to understand that different kinds of expertise could be equally valuable, that success in contemporary business required diverse perspectives and authentic engagement, rather than just traditional corporate skill. The next few days brought a flurry of activity as Victoria's team continued implementing expansion plans that were transforming our operation from a neighborhood coffee shop into the flagship location of a regional network of sustainable businesses. The new roasting equipment had arrived from Germany, massive machines that could handle much larger batches while maintaining the precision temperature control that ensured consistent quality across different bean varieties. Angela Vasquez had settled into her role as director of sourcing with remarkable efficiency, using her existing relationships with farming cooperatives to negotiate contracts that provided better prices for growers while ensuring reliable supply chains for our expanding operation. Her office walls were covered with photographs from coffee farms throughout Central America, images that told stories of partnership and mutual respect, rather than the exploitative relationships that characterized much of the global coffee trade. The integration of Mountain Source Coffee had proceeded even more smoothly than I'd hoped, with Angela's expertise in green bean evaluation complementing our roasting and retail capabilities in ways that strengthened every aspect of our operation. Customers who had never thought much about coffee origins were becoming fascinated by the stories behind their daily beverages, asking detailed questions about farming methods and cooperative structures that demonstrated genuine engagement with issues of social and environmental responsibility. But the most exciting development was the pipeline of potential partnerships that Victoria's research team had identified throughout the Pacific Northwest. Small businesses that shared our values but lacked access to the capital and strategic support they needed to expand their impact. Each opportunity represented a chance to prove that business could be a force for positive change, when guided by authentic commitment to community development and environmental stewardship. Thursday morning brought an unexpected visit from Victoria herself, who arrived during our busiest period with the kind of unannounced timing that suggested she wanted to observe our operations during normal working conditions, rather than carefully orchestrated demonstration. She ordered our seasonal blend and found a corner table where she could watch customer interactions while reviewing documents that probably contained strategic plans for our continued expansion. I watched her observe our morning rush with the kind of focused attention that had made her one of the most successful investors in the Pacific Northwest. She paid particular attention to how customers engaged with our educational displays, the questions they asked about coffee origins and brewing methods, the way they responded to information about sustainable farming practices and direct trade relationships. When the rush subsided, Victoria approached the counter with a smile that mixed professional satisfaction with genuine warmth. "This is exactly what I was hoping to see," she said, gesturing toward the bustling activity that filled every corner of our expanded space. "The integration of education and retail is working beautifully, and the customer engagement levels are remarkable." Her observation highlighted one of the key differences between our approach and traditional coffee retail, which focused primarily on speed and convenience, rather than customer education and relationship. Our success came from treating every interaction as an opportunity to share knowledge and build connections, creating experiences that were valuable beyond just the beverages we serve. I'm particularly impressed by how seamlessly Angela's sourcing expertise has been integrated into the customer experience. Victoria continued, indicating the display of green coffee beans that allowed customers to see and smell raw coffee from different regions, while learning about the farming methods that produced them. The transparency about supply chain relationships is building exactly the kind of trust that sustainable businesses need to differentiate themselves from commodity-focused competitors. The success of our approach was validation for strategies that many traditional business advisors had warned against, arguing that customers didn't want to be educated about complex supply chain issues and preferred simple, convenient purchasing experiences. But our growing customer base demonstrated that people were hungry for authentic information about the products they consumed, especially when that information connected them to meaningful stories about environmental stewardship and social responsibility. Victoria and I spent the next hour discussing expansion opportunities and strategic priorities for the coming year. Her research team had identified several potential acquisition targets that could complement our existing operations, while extending our reach into new markets and product categories. A sustainable bakery in Seattle that had built strong relationships with local farmers but needed help reaching customers who appreciated artisanal products. An organic food distributor in Eugene that had developed innovative packaging solutions but lacked retail distribution network. Each potential partnership represented an opportunity to create integrated supply chains that supported sustainable agriculture while providing consumers with access to products that reflected their value. Victoria's vision extended far beyond individual business success to encompass industry-wide changes that could influence how food and beverage companies approached everything from sourcing relationships to customer engagement. The most ambitious possibility involved establishing a network of sustainable food businesses throughout the Pacific Northwest, connected by shared values and mutual support rather than traditional corporate hierarchy. Each member business would maintain operational independence while benefiting from collective purchasing power, shared marketing resources, and coordinated educational programming that could reach larger audiences than any individual operation could manage independently. The conversation was interrupted by my phone, Natalie's name appearing on the screen with timing that felt almost orchestrated to demonstrate the changes that had occurred in our professional relationship. I excused myself and answered the call, curious about what had prompted her to contact me again so soon after our previous conversation. "Zoe, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," Natalie said, her voice carrying the familiar mixture of professional necessity and personal awkwardness that had characterized our recent interactions. "I wanted to follow up on our discussion about potential collaboration opportunity." Victoria watched with polite interest as I handled the call, probably recognizing that family dynamics could significantly impact business decisions and strategic planning. I gestured toward my office, indicating that I needed privacy for the conversation, and Victoria nodded with understanding while settling back into her corner table to review additional documents. "What's the latest development?" I asked, closing my office door behind me while maintaining visual contact with the retail floor through the glass partition that allowed me to monitor operations while handling administrative responsibility. "We've just been contacted by a potential client that I think would be perfect for the kind of collaboration we discussed," Natalie said, her voice carrying genuine excitement that suggested this opportunity was particularly significant for Pinnacle Creative's business development effort. "It's a regional chain of farm-to-table restaurants that wants to completely overhaul their marketing approach to focus on authentic storytelling about their sourcing relationships and sustainable practices." The description immediately caught my attention because restaurant marketing presented unique challenges that required deep understanding of both food service operations and consumer psychology around dining experiences. Most restaurant marketing focused on ambiance and menu appeal rather than the complex supply chain relationships that made farm-to-table dining meaningful from sustainability and community development perspective. That does sound like an interesting challenge, I said, genuinely curious about how traditional marketing firms would approach clients whose success depended on authentic relationships with local farmers and food producers. What specific guidance are they looking for? They want to move away from conventional restaurant advertising that focuses on food photography and price promotions, Natalie explained, her voice carrying the careful tone she used when describing client needs that extended beyond Pinnacle Creative's traditional expertise. Instead, they want to educate customers about the stories behind their ingredients, the farming families who supply their produce, the environmental benefits of choosing locally sourced meals. The approach she described was exactly the kind of authentic engagement that had made Grind and Grace successful, but applying those principles to restaurant marketing would require understanding operational complexities that most marketing professionals had never encountered. Restaurants operated on much tighter margins than retail coffee businesses, with customer expectations and service demands that created different constraints around educational programming and community engagement. The challenge would be developing marketing strategies that communicated authentic commitment to sustainable practices without slowing down service or overwhelming customers who might just want enjoyable dining experiences, rather than detailed information about agricultural methods and supply chain relationships. Success would require finding the right balance between education and entertainment, providing enough information to build trust and connection without creating barriers to customer satisfaction. I'd be interested in learning more about their current operations and what kinds of changes they're hoping to implement, I said, which was true despite my recognition that restaurant consulting would require expertise that extended well beyond my coffee industry experience. Do they already have strong relationships with local suppliers, or are they looking for guidance about developing those partnerships as well? The question was important because authentic farm-to-table marketing required genuine operational changes rather than just messaging adjustments. Restaurants that wanted to communicate meaningful connections to local agriculture needed to actually source ingredients from nearby farms, work directly with producers to ensure quality and consistency, and structure their menus around seasonal availability rather than customer convenience. That's exactly why they need someone with your background, Natalie said, her voice carrying the kind of respect that had been completely absent from our interactions just a few weeks earlier. They've been trying to develop supplier relationships independently, but they're struggling with the same challenges you've mastered in the coffee industry. How to evaluate quality and authenticity, how to structure partnerships that benefit both businesses, how to communicate those relationships effectively to customers who care about sustainability. The recognition of my expertise was gratifying, especially coming from someone who had previously dismissed my business knowledge as irrelevant to serious commercial operations. But it also highlighted how much the market was changing, with consumer preferences increasingly favoring businesses that could demonstrate authentic commitment to environmental and social responsibility rather than just projecting images of success through traditional marketing techniques. We spent another 15 minutes discussing the potential scope of the consulting arrangement and how it might be structured to benefit all parties involved. Natalie was remarkably flexible about financial terms and decision-making authority, perhaps because she understood that my expertise was becoming increasingly valuable in a market that was moving away from conventional advertising approaches toward authentic relationship building and educational engagement. When I returned to the retail floor, Victoria was deep in conversation with Angela about potential sourcing opportunities in South America, their discussion covering everything from organic certification processes to cooperative governance structures that could ensure sustainable development in coffee-growing regions. The level of detail in their conversation demonstrated the kind of operational expertise that distinguished serious sustainable businesses from companies that were simply trying to appeal to environmentally conscious consumers through superficial marketing claims. I'm sorry for the interruption, I said, settling into the chair across from Victoria while Angela excused herself to handle a shipment of green beans that had just arrived from Guatemala. That was my sister, following up on some potential collaboration opportunities between our operations and her marketing firm. Victoria's expressions suggested polite interest mixed with the kind of strategic thinking that evaluated every business relationship for potential benefits and risks. She had probably researched Pinnacle Creative's client base and service offerings as part of her due diligence process, understanding how partnerships with traditional marketing firms might complement or complicate our authentic approach to customer engagement and community building. "How do you feel about working more closely with your sister's business?" Victoria asked, her voice carrying the neutral tone she used when exploring potentially sensitive topics that could impact strategic decision-making. Family relationships can add complexity to professional partnerships, even when both parties have the best intention. The question acknowledged the obvious tensions that existed between our approaches to business and customer relationships, while also recognizing that successful collaboration might benefit both operations if managed carefully. Victoria understood that authenticity couldn't be manufactured through traditional marketing techniques, but she also recognized that effective communication strategies could help sustainable businesses reach larger audiences without compromising their core value. "I think there's potential for productive collaboration," I said, meaning it despite my awareness of the challenges involved in working closely with someone whose professional success had been built on very different principles. Natalie is beginning to understand that contemporary consumers, especially younger demographics, respond better to authentic information than to conventional advertising appeal. If her clients are genuinely committed to sustainable practices, then marketing guidance could help them communicate their values more effectively. The conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from strategic planning for our expanding network of sustainable businesses to practical considerations around maintaining quality standards while increasing production capacity. Victoria's questions revealed her deep understanding of operational challenges and market dynamics, but they also demonstrated her commitment to supporting businesses that could create positive change in their communities and industry. As she prepared to leave, Victoria paused at the counter to purchase several bags of our single-origin coffees, explaining that she wanted to share them with colleagues who were interested in understanding what distinguished truly exceptional coffee from commodity products. The gesture was both professional courtesy and genuine appreciation for the quality we had achieved through careful attention to every aspect of our operation. "You've built something remarkable here," she said, shaking my hand with the firm grip that had characterized our first meeting at my parents' Thanksgiving dinner. "The integration of business success with authentic social responsibility is exactly what I was hoping to support when I started looking for investment opportunities in the sustainable food sector." Her words carried weight that extended far beyond polite compliments, representing validation from someone whose opinion could influence industry practices and investor confidence throughout the Pacific Northwest. But more importantly, they reflected recognition that business could be a force for positive change when guided by genuine commitment to community development and environmental stewardship rather than pure profit maximization. The weekend brought time for reflection and strategic planning, opportunities to step back from daily operational demands and consider the broader implications of the rapid changes that had transformed my professional life over the past month. The coffee shop that Natalie had dismissed as pathetic had become the foundation for a business operation with real influence over sustainable agriculture and ethical commerce throughout the region. But the most satisfying aspect wasn't the financial success or corporate recognition. It was the knowledge that we were proving authentic values could be the foundation for profitable businesses that created benefits for everyone involved. Our customers gained access to exceptional products with meaningful stories, our suppliers received fair prices and respectful treatment, our employees worked in environments that supported their personal values as well as their professional development. Monday morning brought another call from Natalie, this time with specific details about the farm-to-table restaurant chain that was interested in overhauling their marketing approach. The company operated 6 locations throughout Oregon and Washington, with plans for expansion into California markets that would require more sophisticated communication strategies about their sourcing relationships and sustainability commitment. The preliminary meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon at their flagship location in Portland's Pearl District, an upscale neighborhood that attracted exactly the kind of customers who would appreciate authentic information about sustainable agriculture and local food systems. The restaurant's current marketing focused primarily on ambiance and chef credentials, missing opportunities to communicate the environmental and social benefits that could differentiate them from competitors who were increasingly adopting similar menu concepts. I spent the intervening days researching their operations and current supplier relationships, trying to understand how authentically they were implementing farm-to-table practices versus simply using the terminology as marketing positioning. The distinction was crucial because customers who cared about sustainability could usually tell the difference between genuine commitment and performative messaging, and marketing strategies that attempted to exaggerate environmental benefits often backfired by undermining trust and credibility. The research revealed a mixed picture that was probably typical for restaurants attempting to transition toward more sustainable operations. Some locations had developed strong relationships with nearby farms and were genuinely sourcing ingredients locally and seasonally, while others were struggling with the logistical complexities and cost implications of coordinating with multiple small suppliers rather than relying on large-scale distributors. The inconsistency created both challenges and opportunities for developing effective marketing strategies that could communicate authentic commitment to sustainability, while acknowledging the practical constraints that made complete local sourcing difficult during certain seasons or in specific geographic markets. Success would require honest communication about both achievements and limitations, building trust through transparency rather than trying to project perfection that didn't reflect operational reality. Thursday afternoon brought crisp December weather that made Portland feel energetic and alive as I walked through the Pearl District toward the restaurant that represented my first major consulting opportunity outside the coffee industry. The neighborhood was filled with galleries and boutiques that catered to customers who appreciated authenticity and craftsmanship, the kind of consumers who would be most receptive to detailed information about sustainable agriculture and ethical sourcing practices. The restaurant itself was elegantly appointed without being intimidating, designed to feel welcoming and comfortable rather than exclusive or pretentious. The open kitchen allowed customers to observe food preparation while reading menu descriptions that emphasized local ingredients and seasonal availability, though the current marketing materials focused more on chef biographies and dining awards than on relationships with farming community. Natalie was already seated at a corner table when I arrived, dressed in the kind of professional attire that projected competence and success while remaining approachable enough for client meetings in creative industry. She stood to greet me with a handshake that felt more formal than our usual family interactions, probably because she was treating this as a business meeting where our professional relationships took precedence over personal dynamics. The restaurant's general manager David Chen joined us within a few minutes, along with their marketing director Sarah Kim, both carrying portfolios that probably contained current promotional materials and financial data related to their marketing budget and customer demographic. Their approach suggested they were serious about making significant changes rather than just seeking minor adjustments to existing strategy. David was a man in his early 50s with the kind of focused energy that characterized successful restaurant operators, someone who understood both the creative aspects of food service and the operational complexities that made restaurants profitable in competitive markets. Sarah appeared to be in her 30s with experience in traditional restaurant marketing, though her questions suggested she was frustrated with conventional approaches that weren't generating the kind of customer engagement they needed to differentiate themselves from increasing competition. The conversation began with David explaining their vision for authentic farm-to-table dining experiences that would educate customers about sustainable agriculture while providing exceptional meals that justified premium pricing. Their goal was to become known as the restaurant group that customers chose when they wanted to support local farmers and environmental stewardship, rather than just when they wanted impressive food and elegant settings. The challenge was communicating that mission effectively to customers who might be skeptical about restaurant claims regarding sustainability, especially given how many establishments had adopted farm-to-table terminology without implementing meaningful changes to their sourcing practices. Success would require demonstrating authentic commitment through specific actions and transparent communication, rather than relying on marketing messages that couldn't be verified through direct customer experience. Sarah described their current marketing approach, which relied heavily on food photography and chef profiles that emphasized culinary training and award recognition rather than relationships with local suppliers or environmental impact. The materials were professionally produced and visually appealing, but they didn't differentiate the restaurants from dozens of other establishments that used similar promotional strategies without addressing the sustainability concerns that motivated their target customers. I spent considerable time asking questions about their actual sourcing relationships and operational practices, trying to understand how authentically they were implementing the values they wanted to communicate. The answers revealed a complex picture of genuine commitment, mixed with practical constraints, that made complete local sourcing challenging during certain seasons or for specific ingredient categories. Their produce sourcing was genuinely impressive, with direct relationships to farms within 50 miles of most locations, and menu planning that adapted to seasonal availability rather than forcing year-round consistency that would require importing ingredients from distant suppliers. But their protein sourcing was more complicated, with some locations using local ranchers while others relied on regional distributors who could provide consistent quality and pricing but didn't offer the same transparency about farming methods and animal welfare practices. The inconsistency wasn't necessarily problematic from a marketing perspective, but it required honest communication about both achievements and limitations, rather than broad claims about sustainability that couldn't be supported across all locations and menu categories. Customers who cared about these issues usually preferred transparency about challenges and ongoing improvements over marketing messages that overstated current accomplishments. We spent 2 hours developing a communication strategy that would highlight genuine achievements while acknowledging areas where continued improvement was needed. The approach emphasized storytelling about specific farming relationships and seasonal menu development, providing customers with detailed information about ingredient origins, while avoiding claims that couldn't be verified through direct experience. The most innovative aspect involved creating educational programming that would allow customers to visit partner farms and participate in seasonal activities like harvest festivals and sustainability workshops. These experiences would build deeper relationships between customers and food sources, while providing content for marketing materials that demonstrated authentic commitment, rather than just projecting environmental responsibility through advertising claims. By the end of the meeting, I was excited about the potential for creating marketing strategies that could influence how restaurants throughout the region approached customer education and supplier relationships. The success of this project could demonstrate that authentic sustainability communication was not only possible but more effective than traditional advertising approaches for reaching customers who prioritized environmental and social responsibility. Natalie was clearly pleased with how the meeting had proceeded, recognizing that my contributions had elevated the discussion beyond conventional marketing tactics toward strategic thinking about customer relationships and community engagement. The sister who had once dismissed my business knowledge was now witnessing its application to challenges that required exactly the kind of authentic expertise I had developed through years of building genuine relationships with suppliers and customers. As we prepared to leave, David handed me a folder containing detailed information about their current operations and supplier relationships, explaining that he wanted me to visit several of their locations and partner farms before developing final recommendations. The request demonstrated serious commitment to implementing meaningful changes, rather than just adjusting marketing messages without addressing operational practices. Walking back through the Pearl District as early winter darkness settled over Portland, I reflected on how completely my professional life had changed since that Thanksgiving dinner when Natalie had dismissed my work as pathetic. The coffee shop owner who had struggled to gain respect within her own family was now consulting with established businesses about strategies that could influence industry practices throughout the Pacific Northwest. But the most gratifying aspect wasn't the professional recognition or financial opportunities. It was the knowledge that authentic values could be the foundation for successful businesses that created benefits for entire communities. Every project I worked on now had the potential to strengthen relationships between consumers and producers, to support sustainable agriculture and ethical commerce in ways that proved business could be a force for positive change when guided by genuine commitment, rather than pure profit maximization. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of Cascade Holdings' downtown Portland headquarters, looking out at the Columbia River while preparing for the quarterly board meeting that would determine our expansion strategy for the coming year. The view was spectacular, but what made the moment truly remarkable was the agenda in my hands, listing my presentation as the centerpiece of strategic planning discussions that would shape investment decisions across the Pacific Northwest. The Sustainable Food and Beverage Division had exceeded every projection Victoria had made when she first proposed the acquisition. Our network now included 12 businesses across Oregon and Washington, from the original Grind and Grace coffee operation to a cooperative of Native American food producers whose traditional preservation methods were revolutionizing the artisanal foods market. Each partnership had strengthened our collective impact while maintaining the authentic relationships that made sustainable business meaningful rather than just profitable. Angela knocked softly on the conference room door, carrying the presentation materials that would demonstrate our division's growth and future potential to investors who were accustomed to evaluating success through traditional financial metrics. Her transformation from struggling import business owner to director of sourcing for a regional network had been remarkable, but more importantly, her expertise had enabled farming partnerships that were changing agricultural practices throughout Central America. "The numbers are even better than we hoped," she said, spreading quarterly reports across the polished conference table. Revenue growth of 42%, customer retention rates above 90% across all locations, and supply chain relationships that are providing income stability for over 300 farming families. The impact metrics are extraordinary. The financial success was gratifying, but the social and environmental measurements were what truly mattered. Every business decision we made considered effects on farming communities, environmental sustainability, and customer education, proving that commercial viability and social responsibility could reinforce rather than conflict with each other. We had created a model that other investment firms were beginning to study and replicate. Victoria entered the conference room precisely on time, carrying herself with the confident authority that had made her one of the most respected business leaders in the region. She was followed by the other Cascade Holdings executives and board members, people whose investment decisions influenced economic development throughout the Pacific Northwest. Today's presentation would determine whether our approach could be scaled to national markets. "Zoe, I'm looking forward to hearing about your strategic vision for the next phase of expansion," Victoria said, settling into her chair at the head of the table. "The board has been impressed by the division's performance, and we're particularly interested in understanding how the educational programming model could be applied to other industries." The question addressed one of the key innovations we had developed, using customer education as both a marketing strategy and a community service that built deeper relationships between consumers and producers. Our cupping classes and farm visits had evolved into comprehensive programs that taught participants about sustainable agriculture, fair trade economics, and environmental stewardship while creating loyal customers who understood the value of ethical business practice. "Thank you, Victoria," I said, activating the presentation screen while feeling the familiar excitement that came from sharing work I genuinely cared about. Over the past 6 months, we've proven that authentic sustainability education creates customer relationships that are both more profitable and more meaningful than traditional marketing approaches. Today I want to show you how this model can transform entire industry sectors while generating returns that exceed conventional investment strategies. The presentation began with case studies from our existing businesses, demonstrating how transparent communication about sourcing relationships and production methods had increased customer loyalty while reducing marketing costs. Our restaurants were seeing repeat visit rates that were 30% higher than industry averages, while our food producers were commanding premium prices that reflected customer appreciation for ethical practices. But the most compelling data involved the ripple effects throughout supply chain, how our commitment to fair pricing and long-term partnerships was enabling farming communities to invest in sustainable infrastructure and diversified crops that reduced environmental impact while increasing income stability. Every dollar customers spent at our businesses was creating multiple dollars of positive impact in rural communities. The board members asked thoughtful questions about scalability and competitive advantages, whether our approach could maintain its effectiveness as operations grew larger and more geographically dispersed. These were legitimate concerns, given how many sustainable businesses had lost their authenticity during expansion phases that prioritized growth over values alignment. "The key is maintaining direct relationships with suppliers and customers, even as we add new locations and product lines," I explained, describing the technology platforms and communication systems we had developed to ensure transparency remained central to operations regardless of scale. Every business in our network maintains decision-making autonomy while benefiting from collective resources and shared expertise. The most ambitious part of the presentation involved our proposal for expanding beyond the Pacific Northwest into California and Colorado regions where consumer demand for sustainable products was growing rapidly, but where authentic supply chain relationships were often difficult to establish. Our existing partnerships with farming cooperatives could provide the foundation for expansion that maintained ethical standards while accessing new customer base. Victoria's questions revealed her strategic thinking about market positioning and competitive differentiation, how our approach could establish dominant positions in sustainable food markets before larger corporations attempted to replicate our methods through acquisition or imitation. The window for establishing authentic relationships was limited, and early entry into new markets would create barriers that would be difficult for competitors to overcome. The financial projections for expansion were impressive but conservative, based on proven performance metrics from existing operations rather than optimistic assumptions about market growth. We were requesting investment capital that would enable careful strategic expansion while maintaining the operational excellence that had made our current businesses successful. After 2 hours of detailed discussion and analysis, the board voted unanimously to approve our expansion plan along with additional investment capital that would enable acquisition of complementary businesses in target markets. The decision represented validation, not just of our financial performance, but of our fundamental approach to business as a force for positive change in communities and environmental systems. As the meeting concluded, and board members departed with copies of our strategic plan, Victoria approached me with the kind of smile that mixed professional satisfaction with personal pride. 6 months ago, when I first proposed acquiring your coffee shop, I knew we could build something significant together, she said. But even I didn't anticipate how quickly you would develop into one of our most effective division heads. The recognition was meaningful, especially coming from someone whose opinion carried weight throughout the regional business community. But more important was the knowledge that our success was creating opportunities for other entrepreneurs who shared our values but lacked access to the resources needed to compete with larger, less principled operations. Later that evening, I returned to the original Grind and Grace location in Southeast Portland, wanting to reconnect with the daily operations that remained the heart of everything we had built. The space had been renovated and expanded again, but it still maintained the intimate atmosphere that made customers feel like they were part of a community, rather than just purchasing beverages from a commercial establishment. Kelsey was training 2 new employees, sharing the same passion for coffee education and sustainable agriculture that had made her such a valuable team member from the beginning. Her expertise had grown along with our operations, and she was now developing training materials that were being used throughout our network to ensure consistent quality and authentic customer engagement across all locations. How did the board meeting go? She asked, pausing her demonstration of proper espresso extraction techniques to check in about strategic developments that would affect everyone who worked for our expanding organization. Better than I hoped, I said, settling onto my usual stool behind the register while breathing in the familiar aromas that had defined my daily life for years before corporate responsibilities began demanding more of my time. We got approval for everything we requested, plus additional resources for acquisition opportunities that could help other sustainable businesses reach their potential. The success felt surreal when I considered how dramatically my circumstances had changed since that Thanksgiving dinner when Natalie had dismissed my work as pathetic. The coffee shop that had struggled to turn consistent profits was now the flagship operation of a business network that was influencing industry practices and community development throughout the region. My phone buzzed with a text from Natalie, a message that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. The restaurant consulting project had been so successful that 3 additional restaurant groups had requested similar services, and Pinnacle Creative was now positioning itself as a specialist in authentic sustainability marketing rather than traditional corporate advertising. The collaboration between our operations had evolved into something that benefited both businesses while maintaining appropriate boundaries around our personal relationships. Natalie had developed genuine expertise in sustainable business communication, while I had gained insights into strategic marketing that made our educational programming more effective at reaching larger audiences. But the most significant change was in our family dynamic. The sister who had spent years treating me like someone who didn't understand real business was now genuinely curious about my work and respectful of the expertise I had developed. Our conversations had become collaborative rather than competitive, focused on sharing insights that could benefit both our professional development and the broader community of sustainable businesses we were working to support. 2 weeks later, I received an invitation that represented the ultimate validation of how completely circumstances had changed. The Portland Business Journal wanted to feature me in their annual profile of rising business leaders, recognizing my role in developing innovative approaches to sustainable commerce and ethical investment strategy. The photo shoot took place at our expanded Grind and Grace location, with images that showed me working alongside team members who shared our commitment to quality and community development. The article would describe our business model and expansion strategy, but more importantly, it would demonstrate that authentic values could be the foundation for successful operations that created benefits for everyone involved. The interview process required reflecting on the journey that had brought me from struggling coffee shop owner to regional business leader, considering what lessons might be valuable for other entrepreneurs who were trying to balance profitability with social responsibility. The most important insight was that authenticity couldn't be manufactured through marketing strategies, but had to be embedded in every operational decision and customer interaction. When the article was published the following month, it generated interest from business schools and investment firms throughout the country, people who wanted to understand how our approach could be applied to other industries and geographic markets. The success was gratifying, but it also created opportunities to influence business education and investor priorities in ways that could benefit sustainable enterprises across multiple sectors. The feature story also prompted an unexpected phone call from someone I hadn't heard from in months. My father's voice carried the kind of pride that made all the challenges and uncertainties worthwhile, recognition from someone whose opinion had always mattered more than public accolades or professional achievement. "Your mother and I have been following everything that's happening with your business," he said, his voice warm with the satisfaction that came from watching his daughter succeed through dedication and authentic commitment rather than shortcuts or compromise. "We always knew you had the determination to build something meaningful, but seeing the impact you're having on entire communities is remarkable." The conversation continued for an hour, covering everything from strategic planning challenges to the satisfaction that came from proving that business could be a force for positive change when guided by genuine value. Dad asked thoughtful questions about expansion strategies and supplier relationships, demonstrating the kind of engaged interest that had characterized our family discussions throughout my childhood. Most importantly, he wanted to understand how I had maintained authentic relationships with customers and suppliers even as operations grew more complex and geographically dispersed. The question reflected his understanding that success without integrity was ultimately hollow, that achievements mattered most when they aligned with personal values and created benefits for others. The answer involved systems and technologies that enabled transparency and direct communication, but more fundamentally, it required hiring team members who shared our commitment to treating business as community service, rather than just profit generation. Every person we employed understood that their work was contributing to something larger than individual success, supporting sustainable agriculture and ethical commerce in ways that strengthened entire regions. As spring arrived in Portland, bringing the kind of weather that made the Pacific Northwest feel like the most beautiful place in the world, I found myself reflecting on how completely my life had been transformed by a series of events that began with family criticism and evolved into opportunities that exceeded anything I had imagined possible. The coffee shop that Natalie had dismissed as pathetic was now part of a business network that was creating economic opportunities for hundreds of people while demonstrating that authentic sustainability could be more profitable than conventional approaches focused solely on short-term gain. Our success was inspiring other entrepreneurs and investors to prioritize community development and environmental stewardship alongside financial returns. But the most meaningful change was in my relationship with work itself. Instead of struggling to justify my choices to people who didn't understand or respect what I was trying to accomplish, I was surrounded by colleagues and partners who shared my commitment to using business as a tool for positive change. Every decision we made strengthened relationships with suppliers, customers, and communities, rather than exploiting those relationships for maximum extraction. The transformation had required perseverance through moments of doubt and criticism, willingness to maintain authentic values even when easier alternatives were available, and recognition that true success came from creating benefits for everyone involved rather than just maximizing personal advantage. These lessons were applicable far beyond coffee or sustainable food, relevant to anyone who wanted to build meaningful work around genuine commitment to community welfare. Standing in our flagship location on a busy Saturday morning, watching customers engage with educational displays about coffee origins while enjoying beverages that reflected months of careful relationship building with farming cooperatives, I understood that we had proven something important about contemporary business. Authenticity and profitability could reinforce each other when operations were designed around genuine value creation rather than artificial scarcity or manufactured differentiation. The journey from dismissed coffee shop owner to regional business leader had been unexpected but not accidental. Every challenge had required developing new capabilities and deeper understanding of how sustainable operations could create competitive advantage while strengthening community. The success had come from staying true to original values while learning to apply them at larger scales and in more complex market environments. My phone buzzed with a notification from the Portland Business Journal article, which had been shared widely across social media by people who were interested in alternative approaches to business development and investment strategy. The attention was flattering, but more importantly, it was creating opportunities for other sustainable businesses to gain recognition and resources that could help them expand their impact. Among the responses was a message from Victoria, forwarding a request from a business school that wanted to develop a case study about our division's approach to sustainable growth and ethical investment. The opportunity would allow us to share insights with future business leaders while continuing to demonstrate that authentic values could be the foundation for operations that created lasting positive change. The request represented validation of everything we had built, recognition that our approach was worthy of academic study and replication in other contexts. But it also represented responsibility to continue innovating and improving, ensuring that our methods remained effective as market conditions and consumer expectations continued to evolve. Most importantly, it confirmed that the dismissive comments at that Thanksgiving dinner had actually been the catalyst for discovering capabilities and opportunities that might never have emerged through conventional career progression. Sometimes the greatest success comes from proving wrong the people who underestimate your potential while maintaining the authentic values that make success meaningful rather than just impressive. The coffee shop that had been called pathetic was now part of a business model that was being studied by universities and replicated by investors throughout the country. Proof that authentic commitment to community welfare and environmental stewardship could create more sustainable competitive advantages than any traditional marketing strategy or financial manipulation. But beyond the professional recognition and financial success, the most satisfying outcome was the knowledge that our work was creating opportunities for other people who shared our values but had been struggling to find business models that aligned with their commitment to social responsibility. Every partnership we formed and every educational program we developed was contributing to a larger transformation in how business could serve community needs, while generating returns that justified continued investment and expansion. The story that began with family criticism had evolved into evidence that authentic values could be the foundation for operations that created benefits for everyone involved, from farmers and suppliers to customers and investors. The journey had required persistence through uncertainty and criticism, but it had ultimately proven that meaningful work was possible when guided by genuine commitment to community welfare rather than just personal advancement. Standing in the space where it all began, surrounded by the aromas and sounds that had defined my daily life before corporate responsibilities expanded my impact beyond anything I had originally imagined, I felt grateful for every challenge that had contributed to this outcome. The dismissive comments that had once hurt so deeply had actually been the beginning of discovering capabilities and opportunities that exceeded every assumption about what was possible when business was approached as community service rather than just profit generation. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.